Hello, fellow sapiens. Whether you're settling into bed, walking the dog, cooking dinner, or working with headphones in, this is your invitation to slow down, to let your restless prehistoric brain uncoil as we tell you a story. A slow one, a strange one, a true one. Here at Sleepless Homo, we don't do wild theories or loud guesses. We do soft science, the kind that whispers through layers of dust and bone. Patient, humble science that admits it doesn't have all the answers, but still stays up late asking the questions. If that sounds like your kind of calm, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this quiet, long-form storytelling reach more tired sapiens like you, the ones who still believe that knowledge matters, that slow thinking is powerful, that maybe, just maybe, soft stories can sharpen minds. And if you want to share, tell us how you use this kind of content. Do you watch while driving, before bed, in the shower, or maybe just let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing this sleepy tribe map itself across time zones. And if you happen to drift off halfway through a chapter, no worries. I've added timestamps in the description so you can pick it up again tomorrow, right where the story left off, because this one's worth finishing. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, why are we the only humans left? Let's rewind the timeline to when we weren't alone. 2 million years ago, the world was full of strangers who walked like us. They chipped stones, they gathered plants, they watched the horizon for danger. But they were not us. Not quite. And the strange thing is, they didn't know that. Because there was no us yet to compare themselves to. There was no species called Homo sapiens to cast its long shadow backward. Instead, there was only a branching tree of close cousins, none of whom had the faintest clue that someday only one lineage would remain, and call all the others extinct. To understand that future disappearance, we have to begin long before it happened, before the mystery, before the ice ages became graveyards, before the names Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, or Denisovan had any meaning. This is a chapter from deep time, a time when the family of humans was still expanding, not shrinking. And the fossil trail leads us not to Europe or China or Australia, but to the continent where nearly every human story begins. Africa. Let us start with one of the quiet revolutions in science. In the past few decades, paleoanthropology has largely retired the idea of a clean, single-file march toward humanity. There is no straight line from ape to man. Instead, the evolutionary history of humans is now best described as a braided stream, full of forking branches, dead ends, and quiet disappearances. What we once called missing links are now seen as snapshots in a process that never stopped changing. And by the time we reached 2 million years ago, the hominin world had already begun to fill with multiple faces, different shapes, different strategies, all carved from the same biological mold. One of the most important players in this early human expansion was a species known as Homo erectus. The name means upright man, and while it was not the first hominin to walk fully on 2 legs, it may have been the first to walk as far as it did. Fossils of erectus have been found in places as far apart as Kenya, Georgia, Indonesia, and China. That alone tells us something remarkable. Long before Homo sapiens ever wandered out of Africa, Homo erectus had already done it, nearly 1 million years earlier. In fact, it may have been the first hominin to cross ecological boundaries at a continental scale. That implies more than just long legs. It implies fire, tools, social cohesion, and the ability to adapt to radically different environments. Homo erectus may have been the first human to see a snowfield and not die immediately. And that's no small thing. The oldest erectus fossils come from East Africa, places like Kubifora in Kenya and Dmanisi in Georgia. Some researchers argue that Dmanisi may not be true erectus, but a transitional form between earlier species and erectus proper. Either way, the skulls found there, with their mix of primitive and derived traits, give us a rare window into the diversity of early Homo. These weren't identical clones spreading out from a single homeland. They were variable, adaptable, and already experimenting with different body sizes and cranial shapes. Their brains were smaller than ours, roughly 600 to 900 cubic centimeters, but their legs were long, their arms were short, and their footprints were unmistakably human. In fact, Homo erectus may have looked more familiar in silhouette than in the face. Just how smart were they? We don't really know, but they left behind the earliest evidence of what's called the Acheulean tool tradition, These were not just chipped rocks, but hand axes, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tools that required planning and spatial reasoning. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus and its relatives made these tools in an almost unchanged form. To modern minds, that seems static, but to archaeologists, it suggests cultural transmission. Someone had to show someone else how to make these, which means teaching and learning, even without words. Erectus may also have been the first hominin to control fire, though this point remains debated. Burnt bones and charred sediments from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa suggest that some populations were using fire as early as 1 million years ago. But whether they made fire or simply captured it from lightning is still unclear. Either way, fire would have changed everything: warmth, protection, cooked food, and the ability to gather after dark. It may even have reshaped our social behavior, making us more cooperative, more communicative, more human. But Homo erectus wasn't the only experiment running. In parts of Europe, we find evidence of a different lineage, a group that some call Homo antecessor. Discovered in the Atapuerca region of northern Spain, this species lived roughly 800,000 to 1 million years ago. The fossils are fragmentary, and debate rages about whether antecessor deserves its own name or is just an early branch of another species. But one thing is clear: it had a surprisingly modern-looking face. Flat cheeks, small brow ridges, and a large nasal opening. Some scientists argue that antecessor could be the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Others see it as a side branch. The fossil record is like a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and no picture on the box. Meanwhile, in Africa and possibly Europe, another species was rising, one that would become a major player in the human story. Its name is Homo heidelbergensis, and it lived between roughly 700,000 and 300,000 years ago. This was a large-bodied hominin with a big brain, in some cases over 1,200 cubic centimeters. That's within striking distance of the modern human range. Heidelbergensis made sophisticated tools, built shelters, and likely hunted large game in coordinated groups. In some regions, it appears to have used wooden spears, the earliest known projectile weapons in the archaeological record. What's fascinating about Heidelbergensis is that it appears to have given rise to multiple later human lineages. In Africa, it may have evolved into Homo sapiens. In Europe, into Neanderthals. And in Asia, possibly Denisovans. In other words, this was not just a species, it was a branching point, a genetic crossroads, and it may be the last common ancestor of all the human forms that will soon populate the rest of this story. It is important to note that all these species coexisted in overlapping time windows. Erectus did not vanish when antecessor appeared. Heidelbergensis didn't wait its turn like an actor in a play. Evolution doesn't run on scripts. It runs on chaos, isolation, selection, and chance. For hundreds of thousands of years, multiple types of humans shared the same Earth, sometimes in the same regions. We cannot say exactly how they interacted, if at all. We don't even know what they called each other. But it is entirely possible that in some ancient valley, two different species of humans once sat beside the same fire. What we can say is this: diversity used to be the norm, not the exception. The idea of a world with only one human species is not natural. It's recent, and probably temporary. We, the survivors, often assume there was something inevitable about our existence, that we were somehow destined to win. But the early Pleistocene world offers no such comfort. It shows us a time when we were not special, when we were one of many, and when the story of humans was not a single thread but a tangled web of paths, some of which would vanish forever. Why did some of these species disappear while others endured? Was it climate, chance, competition, or a mix of all three? We don't yet know. But the next part of the story will take us deeper into those mysteries. Because as we follow the fossil trail forward, we begin to see signs of selection, isolation, and extinction. The family tree starts to thin, and the question begins to form, like a shadow on the horizon: why us? They moved like whispers through the grasslands. They did not know they were special. They did not know that one day they would be remembered as the first humans to walk out of Africa. They were just adapting, just eating, just surviving. But sometime around 1,900,000 years ago, a quiet revolution began. No war, no flag, no plan. Just a few upright apes with long legs and stone tools, drifting across savannas, rivers, and volcanic valleys. We call them Homo erectus, though they would not have used names. Their bones are now scattered across 3 continents, resting beneath villages, deserts, and shopping malls, silently recording the beginning of a very strange planetary experiment. A world populated by multiple human species evolving in parallel. How did we spread so far, so early, and why did no one tell us we were writing the first pages of a story that would eventually lead to DNA tests, quantum computing, and microwave burritos? The story of our spread into the old world starts with something surprisingly humble: legs. Compared to earlier hominins like Australopithecus or even Homo habilis, Homo erectus had longer limbs, narrower hips, and an energy-efficient stride. This wasn't about speed, it was about distance. Their anatomy was optimized not for running away from lions, but for walking beyond horizons. When we look at the fossil evidence, one of the earliest and clearest signs of this shift is found in a little valley in Georgia. Not the American state with peaches and southern charm, but the Denisovans site in the Caucasus Mountains. Here, 5 ancient skulls were unearthed, dating back to about 1,800,000 years ago. The fossils are small-brained by modern standards, but fully upright, fully mobile, and accompanied by a suite of stone tools that make it clear. This was a type of human who had left Africa behind. Denisovans changes everything because it shows that humans didn't need big brains or fire or even particularly advanced tools to expand. They just needed bodies that could travel and enough flexibility to survive in new habitats. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, that is already remarkable. For a long time, scientists assumed that leaving Africa required a technological or cognitive leap, but Denisovans challenges that. These early migrants were using fairly simple Oldowan-style tools, just flakes and cores mostly, yet they managed to thrive in a new biome, far from their evolutionary homeland. It suggests that the key to expansion was not invention, it was adaptability. From Denisovans, the traces of humanity begin to scatter across the old world like breadcrumbs. Fossils attributed to Homo erectus, or closely related forms, appear in Java, Indonesia, by around 1,600,000 years ago. In China, sites like Gongwangling and Lantian show evidence of early humans living in forested environments, adjusting to colder winters and a wider variety of resources. At Sangjiran on the island of Java, skull fragments reveal a population that would go on to persist for over 1 million years. That's longer than any single civilization has lasted in human history. It's difficult to wrap our heads around timelines like that, but when you see a thick-browed fossil from Java, you're looking at a relative who thrived for hundreds of thousands of years longer than Homo sapiens have even existed. They were not a side note, they were the main act, for a long time. What's striking about these early wanderers is just how varied their environments were. In Africa, Homo erectus occupied dry savannas and brushland. In the Levant, they lived near lakes and marshes. In East Asia, they adapted to subtropical forests and highland plateaus. They left behind butchered bones, ancient campsites, and stone tools that vary slightly from region to region. It's not flashy. There are no cave paintings yet, no jewelry. But this phase of human history isn't about symbols. It's about survival. And the sheer geographic spread tells us that these humans weren't just drifting aimlessly. They were enduring. There are signs that these early humans may have had some ability to control fire, especially in sites dated closer to 1 million years ago, but the evidence is still debated. Charred bones and ash layers exist at some sites, like in Israel and South Africa, but whether this means they were making fire or just taking advantage of natural blazes is not fully resolved. Either way, these were hominins capable of flexing their behavior across different landscapes. They didn't build cities, they didn't write epics, but they learned to work with what they had, in climates that varied wildly. And that's one of the most overlooked superpowers in the human lineage. The ability to survive in habitats we were never designed for. By about 1,200,000 years ago, Homo antecessor, a debated species that might be an early offshoot of Homo heidelbergensis, or just a regional variation of Homo erectus, appears in the fossil record of Spain. The Atapuerca site reveals not only tools and bones, but possibly one of the earliest signs of organized behavior, deliberate processing of bodies. Whether this was cannibalism or ritual is still uncertain. But the presence of multiple individuals, handled in a consistent way, points to something we see again and again in human evolution: a growing interest in the dead, in the body, and perhaps in memory. Even at this early stage, there may have been glimmers of something more than just hunting and gathering. What makes this phase of human expansion so compelling is that it forces us to rethink what it means to be human. These early populations didn't look or behave exactly like us, but they were us in the evolutionary sense. They carried the same genetic legacy that would one day give rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. They were not our failed cousins. They were our grandparents, many times removed. And their success across Africa, Europe, and Asia set the stage for a strange phenomenon: regional evolution. As small groups of humans settled into different climates, over thousands of generations, they began to diverge. Not enough to lose the ability to interbreed, but enough to become visibly and behaviorally distinct. This is the beginning of the human kaleidoscope, a time when the family tree starts to branch in earnest. And yet, no one knew it. No one was aware they were part of a great experiment in parallel evolution. No Homo erectus paused to consider that their distant relatives, 500,000 years later, would dig up their skulls and argue over taxonomy. They were just living, finding water, avoiding predators, raising children, and moving forward, always forward. Today we find their fossils in unlikely places, under highways, in riverbeds, in forgotten caves. The bones don't speak, they don't tell us their names or what they believed, but they do whisper something subtle. They tell us that long before Homo sapiens ever walked the earth, the world was already full of humans. Not copies, not mistakes, just different ways of being hominin. The idea that we are alone now is a recent one. For most of the past 2 million years, we were not the only humans. We were one of many. And for the longest time, we weren't even the most interesting. So the question lingers. If early humans could spread so far, with so little technology, what were they chasing? Was it game? Was it water? Was it just curiosity? Or was it something deeper? A biological restlessness, etched into the marrow of our bones, that pushes us toward new lands, even when we don't know why. We'll never know what drove the first hominin to walk out of Africa, but they did. And in doing so, they turned the earth into a stage for something that no other animal had tried before. A global experiment in being human. And it had only just begun. What if we've already forgotten most of our family tree? That's not just a sentimental question. It's a real scientific problem. Because the further we look back, the more the fossil record begins to resemble a shredded family album. Bones torn from context, names built from fragments, whole species proposed from a single molar or a sliver of jaw. We know there were more humans than we have bones for, possibly many more. Some we suspect from mysterious DNA. Others we have physically uncovered, but only barely. Their bodies are missing. Their tools are strange. Their genetics are either unknown or unclassifiable, and yet they matter, because each one of them held a mirror to what it meant to be human long before we started calling ourselves special. Between 900,000 and 400,000 years ago, something strange was happening across the Old World. In Africa, Asia, and the island fringes of Southeast Asia, several different human lineages were either diverging, overlapping, or vanishing without leaving much of a trail. It was not the world of tidy speciation that textbooks used to imagine. It was a mess of shadows, ghost populations, and species we hesitate to even call species. And at the heart of that uncertainty lies a question more unsettling than extinction itself. What if we've never known how many kinds of humans there were in the first place? Take Homo naledi. Discovered deep in South Africa's Rising Star cave system, naledi instantly disturbed the tidy ladder of human evolution. Their bones, intentionally placed in near inaccessible chambers, suggest burial, or at least body disposal behavior. But their brain was only the size of an orange. Their hands were human-like, their shoulders ape-like, their feet made for walking, their fingers curved like climbers. Radiometric dating placed them at around 230,000 years ago, meaning they existed at the same time as anatomically modern humans in Africa. But naledi is older than that too. Their morphology suggests they could have split from other human lineages as early as 2 million years ago. In other words, this was a species that may have survived for well over 1 million years, hidden in the fossil record, practicing behavior we once assumed belonged only to us, but doing it with a brain one-third the size of ours. On the other side of the planet, the story grows even more elusive. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, a few teeth, hand and foot bones, and a fragment of a femur revealed the presence of another small-bodied hominin, named Homo luzonensis. Dated to at least 50,000 years ago, Luzonensis defied classification. Their teeth looked like early Homo, their feet curved like a tree dweller, their size and island geography echoing the famed Homo floresiensis of Indonesia. But with no DNA recovered and such limited material, we can't say where they came from. Were they descended from Homo erectus, or an even older unknown wave of human migration into Southeast Asia? And were they truly a separate species, or a regional population that adapted in extreme isolation? And then there are the Red Deer Cave people. Discovered in southwestern China, these remains are only about 14,000 years old, shockingly recent in evolutionary terms. But their anatomy was strange, a mix of archaic and modern traits, including thick skull bones, large molars, a flat face, and no chin. Some researchers argued they were a late surviving archaic population. Others said they could be hybrids, the legacy of earlier interbreeding between divergent Homo groups. Genetic data was limited. The argument continues. But their very existence reminds us that the line between modern and archaic is a modern invention. Evolution did not cleanly replace one group with another. It overlapped, recombined, lingered. This is what makes the Middle Pleistocene so hard to narrate. It is full of partial species. Some are known only from teeth or skull fragments. Others show a puzzling combination of features that refuse to align with any existing definition of human. And even the species we do classify, like Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, show enormous variation across time and space. Were they truly one species with flexible traits, or many regional lineages that blurred into one another? Was heidelbergensis even a real species, or just a convenient name for the transitional fossils scattered across Europe and Africa? Modern genetics has only deepened the confusion. We now know that multiple hominin groups were interacting for hundreds of thousands of years. That means some of these bones might not represent neatly separated species at all, but local populations in the long entangled stream of human ancestry. Some ancient DNA sequences from modern Africans hint at ghost populations that contributed ancestry but left no fossil remains we can match. Others suggest repeated waves of admixture between deeply diverged groups. And because DNA does not preserve well in hot, wet environments, most of Africa and Southeast Asia remain genetic blind spots. We might be walking past the remnants of unknown human cousins every time we dig. So how many human species were there really? 18 is a common number. 21 if you're feeling generous. But the true answer is that we don't know, and we probably never will. Our definition of species is already fuzzy, and hominins interbred too often to leave clean boundaries behind. Even among scientists, the debate is active. Some prefer a lumper model, grouping fossils into broad categories like erectus or heidelbergensis. Others are splitters, seeing the regional variation as a sign of distinct species. The debate isn't just academic, it shapes how we see ourselves, whether as the lone survivors of a crowded evolutionary stage or as the end result of constant blending, braiding, and geographic drift. But the real haunting fact isn't how many species there were, it's how few we truly understand. Each bone is a glimpse through a fog, each fragment a relic of a life we will never reconstruct in full. And that means most of the story of our species, and our siblings, is already gone. Written in teeth worn down by untraceable food, lost in mitochondrial lines that died out, scattered in sediment that may never be excavated. And when we ask why we are the only ones left, maybe we should first ask how many were here, and how many we forgot. What if the real extinction wasn't just biological? What if it was the extinction of memory? Of all the ways of being human we'll never know. They were never meant to be a footnote. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals were not a mystery or a side plot or a species marked for extinction. They were simply people with short, powerful frames, broad noses, and thick bones shaped by ice and time. For most of their long tenure, they were the dominant hominins across Europe and parts of Western Asia, from the Atlantic coast to the foothills of the Caucasus, from the tundra of what is now Belgium to the caves of Israel. Their world was harsh, cold, and demanding. But they did not just survive it, they mastered it. The origins of Neanderthals trace back to a shared ancestor with other archaic Homo populations, likely sometime after 600,000 years ago, when the lineage that would become Neanderthal began to split from other hominins. By around 400,000 years ago, fossils across Europe start showing a consistent suite of traits that would become distinctly Neanderthal. Heavy brow ridges, large projecting faces, robust jaws without chins, a flattened skull at the back, but a cranial capacity rivaling or even exceeding that of modern Homo sapiens. If brain size were destiny, they would still be here. Their bones tell the story of a cold world. Barrel-shaped rib cages helped retain heat. Broad noses may have warmed frigid air. Strong limb bones and compact bodies meant strength over speed, insulation over elegance. These were not adaptations for the tropics. These were bodies made for glacial Europe, and they lasted through multiple ice age cycles, including the brutal cold of marine isotope stage 6, around 200,000 years ago. At a time when climates were wildly unstable and megafauna roamed freely, Neanderthals built their lives on persistence. We know them first through fragments, a skull cap in Belgium in the early 19th century. More famously, bones from the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856 that gave the species its name. Since then, hundreds of individuals have been found from the Iberian Peninsula to Siberia, from open-air camps to deep cave burials. They hunted, they crafted, they endured. In places like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France and Shanidar in Iraq, their skeletons were sometimes found in positions that suggest deliberate burial, or at the very least, care in death. In one cave, a man with multiple injuries, including a withered arm, appears to have been cared for over many years. Whether that was kin loyalty, social insurance, or just part of their normal life, we don't yet know. Their tools evolved over time but were always distinctive. The Mysterian toolkit, typically associated with Neanderthals from about 300,000 years ago onward, was based on flake production using the Levallois technique. This approach allowed them to strike off uniform flakes from a prepared core. What about fire? They used it. Repeated hearths have been found in numerous Neanderthal sites. Burned bones, charcoal, and ash layers point to sustained fire use for warmth, cooking, and possibly light. There is still debate over whether they could make fire themselves or mostly used naturally occurring sources. But the presence of fire over such a long span suggests at least some form of fire management. They lived in caves, yes, but also built structures. At sites like Moldova in Ukraine, there is evidence of mammoth bone circular dwellings that may have been covered with hides. These were not primitive squatters. They engineered shelters in open landscapes with materials available to them. And then there's the culture, elusive but present. Red ochre, feather processing, eagle talons, possible body ornamentation. Some sites show pierced shells or pigments that could have been used for decoration or symbolic signaling. In Bruniquel Cave in France, broken stalagmites were arranged into circles deep inside a cave more than 170,000 years ago. The space was dark, distant from daylight. What did it mean? Ritual? Shelter? We don't know. But it shows intention, organization, and mystery. Neanderthals were not alone. Throughout their long history, they shared landscapes with other species, including possibly Homo heidelbergensis earlier on and later unknown human types in Central Asia. But their domain was Europe, and they dominated it longer than our own species has so far. When the climate changed, they moved. When prey migrated, they followed. When injuries came, they healed. These were not people on the brink. They were people at their peak. And yet, from our perspective, the end seems inevitable. Not because of some inherent flaw or deficiency, but because of what came next. The arrival of others, different pressures, changing climates. But that story has not yet begun. For now, in this window between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals stood not as a failed species, but as the rightful locals of Europe, as varied, complex, and adaptive as any humans who ever lived. If they felt like the only ones, it's because for a time they were, until the world changed again. They left behind no cities, no cave murals, no carved figurines or stone monuments. For most of scientific history, they didn't even exist. And yet, they are inside us. Somewhere high in the DNA of Himalayan people and deep in the genes of Pacific Islanders, the Denisovans left a signature that outlasted their bones. And that is not a metaphor. We have found more DNA from Denisovans than we have found Denisovans themselves. A single cave in the Altai Mountains, near the frigid borders of southern Siberia, gave us almost everything we know about them. Not through skeletons, through shadows. The cave is called Denisova, and it does not look like much. Cold, rocky, partially collapsed. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect the secret to a lost branch of humanity to be waiting. But in the year 2008, Russian archaeologists digging through the thick sediment found something strange in the deeper layers. A finger bone. Small, weathered. From a juvenile. It was not enough to classify as a species. It had no clear anatomical traits to distinguish it. But the preservation was so extraordinary that when scientists ran a genetic analysis, they realized what they had stumbled onto. Not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens, not anything in the known catalog of the genus Homo. Something else. Denisovans, as they were quickly named after the cave, are now considered a sister lineage to Neanderthals. The two likely split from a common ancestor sometime between 500,000 and 400,000 years ago. From that point onward, the Neanderthals moved west into Europe, and the Denisovans scattered east. But what followed was not a story of one empire. The DNA evidence from Denisova Cave suggests multiple populations passed through it over time, with different levels of divergence. Some of them were closely related to the Neanderthal Denisovan ancestor. Others seem to have split off into isolated lineages. One tooth found in the cave appears to be from a Denisovan subgroup that had not been in contact with others for over 200,000 years. In other words, Denisovans were not a monolith. They were a mystery fractal. What we do know comes not from skeletons, but from genomes. The molars they left behind are massive, thick enamel, giant roots, robust chewing surfaces, more like something from an ancient Australopith than a modern human. But they're all teeth. The rest of the body is largely unknown, except for one remarkable hybrid. Found in the same Denisova cave, a piece of long bone was genetically tested in the year 2018. The results shocked even the researchers. Half the genome came from a Neanderthal mother. The other half came from a Denisovan father. This was not just a blend of ancestry. This was a direct first-generation hybrid. A girl, dubbed Denny, who lived sometime between 90,000 and 50,000 years ago. She is the only known individual in human history whose parents were from two entirely different archaic species. Denny's genome opened the floodgates, because if Neanderthals and Denisovans could reproduce together, they weren't isolated. And if Denisovans also encountered Homo sapiens, there could be even more mixtures hidden in our cells. That's exactly what happened. When researchers sequenced the genomes of modern humans in places like Tibet, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, they found Denisovan DNA. Not in tiny traces, but in entire blocks, up to 5% in some populations. These segments are not random. One Denisovan gene variant found in many modern Tibetans helps regulate oxygen in the blood at high altitudes. Without it, living above 4,000 meters would be almost impossible. The implication is staggering. A ghost species that left behind no visible legacy may be the reason humans survive in the Himalayas at all. But where exactly did the Denisovans go? That's harder to answer. Apart from the Altai Mountains, possible Denisovan fossils have been proposed in China and Southeast Asia. One of the strongest candidates is the Siahe mandible, a lower jaw found on the Tibetan plateau and dated to over 160,000 years ago. It was originally thought to belong to some archaic Homo species, but protein analysis revealed it likely belonged to a Denisovan or a closely related group. This would push their known range far beyond Siberia and into the high-altitude environments of Central Asia. Other remains, such as the mysterious Homo longi or dragon man from northeastern China, may also be linked to the Denisovan story. But the connections are still debated, the fossils are fragmentary, and the genetic data is limited. We are reconstructing a species from dental scraps and invisible fingerprints in our blood. That has led some scientists to suggest we may not be talking about one species at all. Denisovans could be a catch-all term for several Eastern Eurasian hominin groups that diverged and interbred repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. The Denisovan genome from the cave might represent just one branch, a visible tip of a much larger tangled root system. And unlike Neanderthals, who left behind clear cultural toolkits like the Mysterian industry, the Denisovans have no firmly associated archaeological tradition. No tools found at Denisova Cave can be definitively linked to them. The same layers include Neanderthal and even early Homo sapiens material. It's a ghost cave filled with other people's bones. What makes all of this even more haunting is that the Denisovans may have lasted far longer than we thought. If they truly extended into Southeast Asia, they may have overlapped with modern humans for tens of thousands of years. And if they lived on isolated islands or in remote mountainous zones, some groups could have survived even longer. One speculative hypothesis is that the Denisovans were the source of interbreeding events in humans that occurred as recently as 40,000 years ago. But because we lack a definitive Denisovan skeleton, there is no way to say for certain what they looked like. Any digital reconstruction is just a model built from genes, not bones. They are the most genetically known but physically unknown species in our genus. We call them Denisovans because of a cave, but in truth, they probably never called one place home. They are a scattered lineage, a genetic echo, and in some populations alive today, they are more than that, a functional part of what it means to be human. We do not know what language they spoke, if any. We do not know how they buried their dead, or whether they had myths, or music, or fire. We only know that when they disappeared, they left something behind in us, something silent, something that helps us breathe thin air and perhaps survive where others could not. So we are left with a question. How do we remember a people who are not quite gone and yet never fully known? The Denisovans may never give us their full story, but the fragments they left behind, in teeth, in bones, in chromosomes, whisper that the human journey was never a straight line. It was braided, and in those tangled branches sometimes it is the shadows that tell us the most. If there is one place where evolution breaks its own rules, it is on islands. The smaller the island, the weirder the outcome. And in human evolution, few stories are stranger, or harder to explain, than those of the tiny people who lived and died on Flores and Luzon. Their bones are few, their mysteries many. But what they reveal is profound. That even among the human lineage, nature kept experimenting, and that sometimes being small, isolated, and forgotten was the winning move. The first puzzle emerged in 2003. Deep in Liangbua Cave on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered the nearly complete skeleton of a small-bodied hominin. She stood just a little over a meter tall. Her brain was roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. Her feet were long, her arms unusually robust, and her skull looked archaic, something out of the distant Pleistocene. But the surprise wasn't that she looked ancient. It was that her bones were only about 60,000 years old. The team named her Homo floresiensis, though the media quickly dubbed her the Hobbit. Then, only a few years later, another strange hominin emerged from the shadows. In Calao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, researchers unearthed several fossil fragments, teeth, foot bones, a bit of femur, and a curved toe, belonging to a previously unknown hominin. These remains were dated to at least 50,000 years ago. Like the Flores fossils, they were small, primitive in anatomy, and clearly distinct from any known Homo species. This new cousin was given the name Homo luzonensis. What made these discoveries so shocking wasn't just their appearance, it was their timing. By 50,000 years ago, most other archaic humans were already disappearing. But here, on these far-flung tropical islands, small-bodied hominins with ancient traits were still alive, and possibly thriving. They had survived for hundreds of thousands of years, alone, without contact with the outside world. They were ghost lineages on islands that acted like time machines. One explanation for their small size is a well-documented evolutionary phenomenon called island dwarfism. In isolated ecosystems with limited resources, large animals often evolve to become smaller. This is true of elephants, hippos, and even deer. On Flores, pygmy elephants once roamed. It seems that hominins may have followed the same path. With fewer predators and scarcer food, the pressure to maintain large bodies and brains diminished. Smaller individuals could survive on less. Over thousands of generations, the species shrank. But it wasn't just about size. The anatomical features of Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis don't align neatly with any known ancestors. Some traits look remarkably primitive, like curved finger bones, robust foot arches, and simple ape-like jaws. Others suggest a mix of lineages, or an independent evolutionary path altogether. And this is where the story gets even more complicated, because we still don't know exactly where these island hominins came from. One possibility is that they descended from an early wave of Homo erectus or an even more primitive hominin like Homo habilis. If so, they may have rafted or drifted to the islands more than 1 million years ago, long before modern humans set foot anywhere near the Pacific. Another theory is that they represent a unique offshoot that left Africa early and evolved in complete isolation. But because their DNA has not been recovered, we are left with anatomy and geography as our only clues. The tools found with Homo floresiensis are simple but effective. Stone flakes and chopping tools, not unlike those used by early hominins in Africa. There's evidence they hunted pygmy elephants and giant rats. In Luzon, cut marks on ancient rhinoceros bones suggest organized butchery by hominins as early as 700,000 years ago, though no fossils from that period have been directly linked to Homo luzonensis yet. What is remarkable is how long these island humans lasted. In evolutionary terms, they persisted in ecological equilibrium. With no need to expand, no new technologies to master, no competition to replace them, they simply continued. Slowly, quietly, unchanged. That is, until something arrived from outside. Something fast, clever, and global. But we will not speak of that here. Not yet. For now, the rule of islands stands. Isolation breeds difference. Small populations drift genetically, morphologically, behaviorally. They shed traits once vital on the mainland, and sometimes they cling to the old ways that no longer exist anywhere else. The fact that we found Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis at all is a miracle of preservation and luck. Most bones decay, most caves collapse, most islands change with the tides and time. These few skeletal hints are all we have, a handful of teeth and metatarsals, telling us that human evolution did not march in a straight line. It forked, wandered, shrank, and sometimes just stood still. And here lies the haunting question. How many other islands once held their own hominins? How many more bones are buried beneath coral, or have long since eroded into the surf? Did other humans evolve in Madagascar, in Japan, in the Caribbean, or in pockets of Southeast Asia never yet explored? When we look at the human family tree, we often imagine branches rising upward toward us. But on these islands, the branches curled back inward, slowed down, and rooted themselves deep into the ground. They did not seek expansion. They sought balance. And for a very long time, they found it. In the end, their extinction is not a mystery in itself. What is mysterious is how they survived so long, unnoticed, and what they might have taught us about resilience, about simplicity, and about the quiet persistence of life when no one is watching. We do not know their names, we cannot hear their stories, but we remember that they were here, that in the places we consider remote, forgotten, and small, great experiments were unfolding. Human experiments, ones that almost no one saw. And that is why their story matters. Not because they were us, but because they weren't. For most of our evolutionary story, we were not the newest model. There was no special unveiling of our species, no singular garden from which we stepped, blinking into the sun. Instead, somewhere between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, a slow and quiet shape began to emerge across the African continent. One that looked a little more like us than what came before. A slightly rounder skull, a slightly flatter face, a slightly stranger mind. But there were no banners, no birth cries from the earth. Just a gradual shift in bones and brains and behavior that would only later be recognized as modern. The creature we now call Homo sapiens did not arrive all at once, and did not arrive alone. For decades, scientists tried to pin down a single moment, a clean origin, a first spark of humanness. But the fossil record did not cooperate. It never does. It gave hints, fragments, clues scattered across time and territory. And slowly, the idea of a single birthplace began to crumble. The face of our species was not born in one location, but in many. We now think that early Homo sapiens emerged from a complex patchwork of populations spread across Africa, connected by partial isolation, then merging again. Not a tree with a trunk, but a braided stream. Take Jebel Irhoud, for example. In the dry hills of modern-day Morocco, archaeologists uncovered skulls that looked uncannily familiar. Not quite human, not quite something else. The fossils were first thought to be around 40,000 years old. Then, with more precise dating, the number jumped to over 315,000. These individuals had faces much like ours, but longer brain cases. A transitional blend, one that pushed back the origin of our species by nearly 100,000 years. Meanwhile, in eastern Africa, another site added its own chapter. In the Homo Kibish formation of southern Ethiopia, two skeletons known as Homo Y and Homo II were uncovered. Homo Y in particular has long fascinated researchers. Its skull, rounded, high-foreheaded with a prominent chin, looks remarkably modern. The dating of the layers it was buried in now places it at around 230,000 years old, possibly older. Florisbad, in central South Africa, gave us another piece. A partial skull with an intermediate form, dated to about 260,000 years ago. Each of these fossils alone might not make sense. Together, they sketch something else entirely, a continent-wide unfolding. But what does it mean to be a modern human anyway? We like to think it's obvious, that there's some checklist of traits we uniquely possess. But when you zoom in, the lines blur. It's not just brain size, though that matters. It's the shape of the brain, its organization, its architecture. Early Homo sapiens had brains as large as ours, but the proportions were different. Over time, the back of the brain shrank slightly. The frontal areas, related to decision-making and social awareness, became more dominant. These changes didn't happen overnight. They may have continued well into the last 100,000 years. In some ways, we may still be evolving into ourselves. There's the face, too. Modern Homo sapiens have a short, tucked-in face compared to earlier humans. Our brow ridges are reduced, our jaws are lighter, and unlike any other species in our genus, we have a chin. No one really knows why. It could be mechanical to stabilize the jaw, it could be social, a byproduct of facial shrinking, or it could be one of those evolutionary mysteries that never fully resolves. We are the only ones with this strange little protrusion, and it marks us, subtly, wherever our faces appear in the record. Yet all of this, the bone shapes, the cranial arcs, is still only a partial story. Bones preserve well, brains do not, behavior even less so. And if you stood face to face with an early Homo sapiens from 200,000 years ago, would you know them as kin? Would they think as we do, love as we do, make art, bury their dead, or whisper stories to their children? For that, the evidence grows thin, but it grows. Some of the earliest signs of symbolic thought and complex behavior also trace back to Africa during this time. In Blombos Cave on the southern coast, archaeologists found engraved ochre blocks over 70,000 years old. Not random scratches, but deliberate crosshatch patterns, a form of representation, perhaps memory, perhaps meaning. Elsewhere, in sites like Pinnacle Point and Sibudu, we see signs of ochre use, shell beads, and complex tools that hint at abstraction. These may not be exclusive to our species, but they suggest a mind that was becoming more fluid, more creative, more layered. Still, we should be cautious. These discoveries are tantalizing, but they don't amount to a sudden awakening. There is no great leap forward here. Just a slow unfolding of cognitive abilities across populations, shaped by ecology, sociality, and time. What we call modern behavior may have emerged gradually, inconsistently, in waves that rippled through early Homo sapiens and possibly other species as well. And this brings us to a more uncomfortable truth. The category Homo sapiens is a box we made, and boxes are tidy. Evolution is not. As new fossils emerge and ancient DNA is extracted, the boundary between species softens. There were humans with skulls like ours who may have lived very differently. There were others who looked archaic but left descendants in our genome. What we call us is not a perfect category. It is a cluster, a tendency, a story told in hindsight. The multiple origin model now dominates the discussion. Instead of a single cradle, Homo sapiens likely arose from interlinked populations across Africa, mixing and separating repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. A study in 2022 analyzed the genomes of nearly 300 people from across the continent and found deep population splits and mergers going back 1 million years. No single group can claim to be the sole ancestor. We are the children of the merge. This has implications beyond science. It changes how we view our identity. If there was no Eden, no single spark, then humanness is not a destination but a process, one that unfolded across landscapes and climates, through droughts and migrations, among foragers and firemakers who never saw themselves as different, only as alive. There are still gaps. Fossils are rare, DNA degrades, and even in Africa, where our species first emerged, many regions remain under-excavated. Entire chapters of our story may be lost to erosion, buried beneath cities, or yet to be found. This is why we speak humbly. What we share is not certainty, but the best approximation we have, given what survives. And so the question lingers. When did Homo sapiens really become Homo sapiens? Was it in the first cranial vaults of Irhud, in the face of Homo Puers, or in the hands that carved ochre and blombos? Maybe none of these. Maybe it wasn't a when, but a where, or a how, or a who. Maybe the question itself reflects our need for clean beginnings, when nature offers none. What we do know is this. By 100,000 years ago, our species had emerged, anatomically distinct, behaviorally capable, still changing, still wandering, still unaware that one day all the others would be gone, and we would be the ones left wondering why. It is one thing to survive. It is another thing entirely to mark a grave, to gather red powder from the cliffs and grind it down into ochre, to press it into a shell or trace it on a wall, to do something unnecessary but meaningful. That is the beginning of a mystery we still live inside. Somewhere between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, some members of Homo sapiens began to do things that were not strictly practical, and that changes the story from this point on. Because while our bodies were already shaped by the long, slow churn of evolutionary time, this was the moment when something in our minds began to flicker toward the symbolic. We do not know what they were thinking. We do not know if they had words. But in the sediments of southern Africa, in places where ancient people once looked out over cold oceans, we find signs that their lives were beginning to carry meanings deeper than mere survival. And perhaps that is the very reason we remember them, because they began to leave marks. At Blombos Cave, just east of the southern tip of Africa, there is a cliffside that opens like a cracked tooth over the ocean. Buried in the ancient layers of sediment inside, researchers uncovered something that had never been seen before. Pieces of ochre, marked with cross-hatched patterns, not just scraped or abraded by use, but intentionally engraved. The oldest of these patterns has been dated to about 75,000 years ago, a piece of soft red stone with a deliberate design etched into its surface. Some have argued it is art. Some say it is not yet art, but the beginning of it. Others say we do not have the right words yet to describe what it is. But whatever it is a message of intention. Someone did this. They shaped the stone and marked it in a way that suggests they were thinking about symbols. Maybe memory, maybe identity, maybe something else entirely. Alongside these engraved stones were beads, not metal or glass, but tiny perforated shells, sometimes coated in ochre. The act of piercing, threading, wearing. These are not acts of hunting or gathering. These are acts of adornment, expression, or perhaps even ritual. The beads at Blombos Cave are some of the earliest examples of personal ornamentation in the world, and they are not isolated. Similar shell beads have been found at sites like Sibidu and Border Cave, and across the African continent in regions where early Homo sapiens walked. In some cases, the shells come from species that do not live nearby, suggesting travel, exchange, or memory of other shores. Even older than Blombos is Pinnacle Point. This site, perched on a sea cliff just west of Blombos, has yielded evidence of ochre use going back more than 160,000 years. Here, too, we find signs of early humans collecting, processing, and possibly using ochre for symbolic purposes. Some pieces were ground with deliberate technique as if to produce powder. And while ochre can be used for hide tanning or insect repellent, the way it was curated suggests something beyond function. It appears in burial contexts, in decorative contexts, in contexts where its only role might have been to mean something. What made Homo sapiens begin doing this? That remains one of the deepest questions in archaeology. There is no gene for symbolism, no obvious leap in brain size. Instead, the fossil record hints at a gradual layering of behaviors, a slow, regionally variable emergence of what we might call symbolic cognition. And it did not happen everywhere at once, nor did it happen in a straight line. The evidence from Africa shows that early Homo sapiens were experimenting with behaviors that allowed them to share ideas across time. These ideas might not have been language as we know it, but they were transmissible. They could be learned, copied, elaborated. And that is the beginning of culture. Not just the culture of tools and techniques, but the culture of thought. A culture in which someone might look at a shell and see more than food, might see memory, might see beauty, might see themselves. One of the oldest potential burials associated with Homo sapiens was found at the site of Omo Kibish in Ethiopia. Though fragmentary and hard to interpret, it suggests that early humans may have begun to treat their dead in ways that were not purely practical. This is another pattern that emerges over time: deliberate burial. Placing the dead in specific positions, sometimes with ochre, sometimes with objects. It is impossible to know whether these were acts of grief, respect, fear, or something entirely alien to us, but they were acts, and actions leave traces. More recently, at the site of Kafze in present-day Israel, burials dated to about 100,000 years ago include individuals placed with care, one with a red deer antler near the body. A child was found with ochre. It is difficult to explain these choices without appealing to symbolic thinking. There is no survival value in burying the dead with red powder or antlers, which means something else was happening. And while we should resist the urge to romanticize or project, it is hard not to wonder whether these were the first whispers of story, the first glimmers of belief. Symbolic behavior is not something we can always define with precision. But archaeologists use certain markers as proxies: use of pigment, ornamentation, burial, abstraction in art, and long-distance trade. In each of these categories, the record becomes more textured during the Middle Stone Age in Africa, especially between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. This is sometimes referred to as the cognitive revolution, though that term implies a suddenness that is not supported by the data. What we see instead is a patchwork. Different groups, in different regions, slowly beginning to weave meaning into their lives in ways that suggest shared mental models. We know that Homo sapiens had large, globular brains by this point. But brain shape alone does not explain symbolic thinking. Something in the social fabric must have shifted too. Perhaps population size increased. Perhaps communication became more layered. Perhaps memory and teaching began to operate differently. Whatever the cause, the outcome was a set of behaviors that began to transcend the immediate present. Symbols are, by definition, references to things not physically present. That leap, from the tangible to the representational, is one of the most consequential in the history of our species. And yet we do not know if it was unique. There are hints that other hominins may have buried their dead or used pigment. But among the early Homo sapiens of Africa, we see these behaviors accumulate and persist. That persistence matters, because what begins as a whisper becomes a rhythm, and rhythm becomes story, and story becomes a way to bind generations. Why does this matter? Because when we try to understand why Homo sapiens were the ones who made it to the present, culture may be part of the answer. Not culture in the modern sense, but culture as transmission, the ability to pass on complex behaviors, symbols, and memories through time. This kind of cultural continuity creates networks. Networks create resilience. Resilience creates survival. And still, we do not know exactly why it started. Maybe someone looked at the red cliffs and thought of blood. Maybe they saw beauty in the spiral of a shell. Maybe the first mark was just a scratch, and the meaning came later. Or maybe the meaning was always there, waiting in the bones, waiting to be noticed. The truth is, we may never fully understand the spark that led to this shift in human behavior, but we can trace its ashes. They lie in the shells, the ochre-stained stones, the shallow graves beneath African sands. In the end, perhaps the most haunting part is not that we once began to tell stories. It is that the story of how that began is one we can never quite tell. It is one thing to know you are not alone. It is another to find proof in your own body. For most of human history, we lived unaware that our ancestors had met others. We assumed that we were one story, told once and told cleanly. But that illusion began to crack when scientists pulled DNA not from bones, but from us. Hidden inside every modern human outside of Africa is a message from someone else, not a parent, not a distant cousin, but a different kind of human entirely. This is the part of the story where Homo sapiens encounters other branches of the family, and where the record of that meeting is not written in fossils, but in genes. The fossil record, with all its missing chapters and accidental preservation, had long made it difficult to say with confidence when, or even if, Homo sapiens had ever crossed paths with other species. But around the early 21st century, a technological revolution in ancient DNA changed everything. In 2010, the genome of a finger bone found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia shocked the world. It belonged to a young girl who was not a Neanderthal and not a modern human. She was something else. Her people would be named Denisovans, after the cave in which she lay. Around the same time, DNA from Neanderthal remains also began to whisper a surprising story. These were not just separate species, they were ancestors. By comparing the genomes of modern humans to these ancient sequences, researchers discovered that Homo sapiens had interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans at least once, and probably many times. This was not just a metaphorical meeting, it was a literal one, and it left its mark. Today, most people with ancestry outside of Africa carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Oceania carry even more Denisovan DNA, in some cases, as high as 5%. These are not just statistical footnotes, they are biological legacies. But where and when did these meetings happen? Clues come from the genomes themselves. DNA, like a forensic map, records where segments have recombined, how old they are, and what paths they may have taken. Based on the breakdown of Neanderthal DNA in modern genomes, scientists estimate that the first interbreeding occurred somewhere between 90,000 and 60,000 years ago. The location is likely the Middle East, perhaps in the region of the Levant. At this point, Homo sapiens had only just begun expanding out of Africa. The early migrating populations would have encountered Neanderthals who had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. It was in this zone, not deep in Europe, not yet in China, that the first known exchange took place. The DNA evidence also suggests that these interactions were not isolated. There were likely multiple interbreeding events over tens of thousands of years. Some were local, some may have been episodic, others left no trace at all. But the ones that did have become part of our biological fabric. For Denisovans, the picture is more complicated. Their remains are sparse, just a few teeth, a finger, and a bone fragment. Yet their genetic legacy is scattered across a huge region, from East Asia to Melanesia. This implies that Denisovans were not a small, mountain-dwelling people limited to a single cave. They may have been a widespread and varied population, perhaps even consisting of several regional groups that scientists have not yet fully mapped. In Tibetans today, a particular gene known as EPS1 helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen levels. This gene is Denisovan in origin. It provides a striking example of how interbreeding may have offered not just ancestry, but adaptation. In this case, the ability to survive and thrive at high altitudes may have come not from trial and error mutation, but from borrowing. Genetic inheritance, in this case, became a shortcut to survival. In other regions, Denisovan DNA appears to contribute to immune function, fat metabolism, and even aspects of brain development, though the evidence remains early and incomplete. Not every piece of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA was beneficial. Some of it may have been neutral, some may even have been slightly harmful. Over time, natural selection appears to have removed many of these foreign segments from the Homo sapiens genome, but others remained, suggesting that the flow of genes was not just a historical event, it had consequences. And it challenges the very concept of species. Traditionally, species are defined as populations that do not interbreed in the wild. Yet here were clearly distinct human forms, separated for hundreds of thousands of years, that still produced fertile offspring. The family tree was less a tree and more a braided stream. What we do not know is how these encounters happened. The DNA does not tell us whether the meetings were peaceful, cooperative, or coercive. We have no record of rituals, language barriers, or emotional outcomes. We have no myth preserved in ochre or etched in ivory that says, "This was the first time we met." What we have are statistical probabilities, inferred dates, and a ghostly map of shared ancestry. And yet, that is enough to reshape how we think about ourselves. Because if Homo sapiens did not emerge in isolation, if our genome is a palimpsest written by many hands, then we are not the final product of a clean break from the past. We are a hybrid, not in the sense of one event, but in the deepest sense of having been part of a crowded world. In recent years, researchers have discovered individuals with even more tangled ancestries. One girl from Denisova cave had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Her genome is the most direct evidence yet of interspecies unions, not inferred, but recorded. And it suggests that these meetings were not freak accidents. They were part of a recurring pattern. In Western Africa, genetic analyses of present-day populations have revealed traces of yet another archaic hominin, one that has left no fossil record, no name, no teeth, not even a cave, only DNA. Somewhere between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, another population contributed up to 19% of the ancestry of some African groups. Who they were and where they went remains a mystery. This is not a story of purity nor of conquest. It is a story of contact, exchange, and complexity. It reminds us that evolution is not linear. It sprawls, it overlaps, it doubles back, it shares. And in that sharing, it blurs the boundaries between categories we once thought were fixed. Homo sapiens did not simply replace other species. We absorbed them, carried fragments of them forward, and became something new. Not because of what we invented, but because of what we inherited. We now know that the ancient world was a mosaic of humans, different forms, different cultures, different strategies for survival. And for a brief time, they walked the same earth, breathed the same air, and left marks on the same genes. Most of them are gone, but not entirely. They are still with us, quietly, in our lungs, our blood, our ability to process oxygen, our immune systems, and the deep structure of our DNA. It is easy to think that Homo sapiens became the only human species because we were somehow better. But the truth is more tangled. We were just lucky enough, connected enough, and hybrid enough to persist. So if you've ever wondered whether your ancestors met others on the long road from the past to the present, the answer is yes. Not only did they meet them, they are part of you. The ones who looked different, the ones who vanished, the ones who stayed in our blood, even when their bones were gone. And perhaps the most haunting question is not where they went, but how much of them we still carry, without knowing it. There are migrations so fast they leave smoke behind, and there are migrations so slow no one realizes they've happened until they're over. Ours, the first truly global one, was somehow both. Between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa and into nearly every ecosystem the planet could throw at them. It didn't happen in a single heroic wave. It happened in patient pulses. A campfire here, a child born further downriver, another group following game or sheltering from wind, and slowly, we were everywhere. This wasn't the first time humans left Africa. Homo erectus had done it well over 1 million years earlier. But they moved differently. Their spread was slower, more linear. We moved like water, adjusting shape, spilling into cracks, responding to drought, bounty, or memory. What made the Homo sapiens expansion so different wasn't just speed. It was the way we adapted to each new world, and how we remembered the old ones. By around 70,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens were already edging into the Arabian Peninsula. From there, they splintered. Some likely followed the southern coastal routes into India and Southeast Asia, skirting the monsoon forests and diving into estuaries. Others crept through green corridors inland, adjusting to the dry uplands and red dust. Archaeological sites in Dhofar and Jebel Faya show hints of this movement, stone tools bearing unmistakable resemblance to African cores, but Twi. As groups moved east, the tools changed again. In India, microblades adapted to dry plains. In China, flaked tools began appearing alongside signs of shifting diets. Evidence suggests some foragers hunted large game, others gathered wild yams, or fished muddy rivers. It wasn't one universal strategy. It was dozens, each a local experiment in how to live. Flexibility was no longer just a survival tactic. It was our default setting. But even that wasn't the most impressive thing. By around 50,000 years ago, humans reached Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea. To get there, they crossed open sea, no land bridges, no visible destination. They likely traveled by raft or canoe, island hopping through the Wallacea region. We don't have the boats, but we have the footprints they left behind. Burned savannas, stone tools in Arnhem Land, genetic signatures still carried by Aboriginal Australians today. These people weren't just surviving, they were shaping the land. Fire patterns suggest deliberate burning of forest undergrowth to encourage edible plants and draw in game. It was knowledge passed down, tested, and kept alive across thousands of kilometers. When you cross an ocean to build a home, you don't do it by accident. You do it with memory. Europe was next. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began appearing in Bulgaria, Italy, and eventually France. They brought something strange with them: bone awls, shell beads, ochre markings. The tools were sharper, more varied. But the objects that endure aren't always practical. They're personal. A pierced shell means nothing to a glacier, but it means everything to a group that still tells stories by firelight. This spread wasn't about outcompeting other humans, not yet. It was about establishing possibility. One more family in a valley, one more fire on a beach. Over time, the presence thickened. What began as scattering turned into settlement. This was how we took the world, not in war, but in whispers. Why did it happen so fast? Some of it may have been climate. Ice Age fluctuations opened and closed corridors. Some of it may have been social. Bigger kin networks meant more marriages, more trade, more memory sharing across distances. But maybe it was also cultural patience, the kind of slow wisdom that doesn't panic when the river dries or the game flees. You keep moving. You try something else. You remember where the rains used to fall. By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had reached nearly every landmass on Earth except the Americas and Antarctica. From Arctic tundra to tropical islands, from dry savannas to dripping caves, they had learned how to live. But not just live, persist, share, change. They hadn't just spread, they had connected. And yet so much of that early story is gone, submerged under sea level rise, overwritten by later footprints. Genetic clues help, but they don't sing. They don't tell us how it felt to be the first human to climb a snow ridge, or the last to see a coastline disappear behind a monsoon cloud. Still, the bones remember. The tools remain. The spread was real. So maybe the mystery isn't why we moved. It's why we never stopped. But movement alone doesn't tell the whole story. The real transformation lay in what these migrations made possible: population expansion, local diversification, and an entirely new scale of human presence on Earth. Once groups of Homo sapiens reached new continents, they didn't just settle, they multiplied. Genetic studies suggest that even modest founding populations, sometimes just a few hundred individuals, could establish a lineage that would shape entire regions for tens of thousands of years. It wasn't conquest, it was persistence, a quiet arithmetic of survival that compounded over generations. By the time Homo sapiens set foot in the open savannas of Australia, they were already changing more than their surroundings. They were changing themselves. The demands of each environment began to sculpt bodies, languages, and lifeways. Some groups adapted to highlands, others to coastal zones, still others to arid interiors where water itself became a kind of knowledge. There is no one version of early Homo sapiens after this point. There are only many experiments in how to be human. Some spoke in clicks, others painted with ochre. All carried with them the cognitive flexibility that had allowed their ancestors to walk out of Africa in the first place. Yet this flexibility didn't guarantee comfort. Reaching new lands meant confronting unfamiliar dangers, predators, pathogens, unfamiliar plant toxins, and terrain shaped by glacial cycles or seasonal flooding. It took skill to survive, but it also took memory. A single wrong turn in the Australian bush or the Siberian taiga could be fatal. So the stories mattered, where the good roots grew, when the rains would come, which river meant death and which meant fish. These early travelers likely wove geography into mythology, not to entertain, but to remember. And then came the ice. As groups moved northward into Eurasia, they faced the biting winds and brutal cycles of the last ice age. Between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, much of northern Europe was a shifting mosaic of tundra, glacier, and mammoth steppe. Yet even here, Homo sapiens found ways to live. In the caves of France and Spain, and eventually beyond the Urals, they took shelter from wind and time. They used bones as tools, as weapons, and occasionally, perhaps, as calendars. The lines scratched into antler and ivory may have marked the moon, the seasons, or something else entirely. We don't know for sure. But we do know they didn't stop, even when the cold bit deeper than bone. By 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were beginning to appear across Central Asia and into Siberia. Stone tools, hearths, and carved ornaments suggest not just passage but presence. These weren't lost wanderers. They were skilled navigators of a changing world. Some may have followed rivers fed by glacial melt. Others trailed herds of reindeer or wild horses across open steppes. At least some must have learned to anticipate the migrations of animals just as carefully as they remembered the stars. And still they moved. Across the cold shoulders of Asia, groups pressed onward, reaching what we now call the Russian Far East by around 40,000 years ago. From there, the path toward the Americas lay open, though that chapter was only just beginning. But already, the map of human movement was planetary. In less than 30,000 years, Homo sapiens had gone from regional species to global presence. No single migration explains it. No master plan. Just the relentless pull of what's over the next hill, and the ability to survive once you get there. What's often forgotten in this story is the scale of distance. A single family walking 30 kilometers every few weeks could, over centuries, shift the center of human life across continents. The movement wasn't fast in human time, but in evolutionary time, it was lightning. And wherever these people went, they made marks. Sometimes it was charcoal on a cave ceiling. Sometimes it was a notch in a femur. Sometimes it was nothing more than a tiny shift in the DNA of a local species of lice, or the charcoal record of a deliberately lit fire. In places like Lake Mungo in Australia or the Willandra Lakes region, we find some of the oldest evidence of deliberate cremation. Bodies buried with care, ochre-stained bones. This wasn't just survival anymore, this was symbolic life. This was culture migrating, not just genes. And wherever culture went, it took with it a strange and powerful ability, the capacity to imagine futures. Whether carved into mammoth ivory or whispered over embers, early Homo sapiens didn't just remember, they anticipated. This shift, from presence to pattern, is one of the most important turning points in the entire human story. Migration was no longer just about moving when the food ran out. It was about forecasting, planning, returning. A group might range hundreds of kilometers over a year, but always come back to the same riverbank in spring. Memory became map, and the world, once so vast and scattered, began to feel knowable. And yet, much of it is still invisible to us. So many paths vanished beneath forests, deserts, or ocean. Sea level rise erased entire chapters. If we only followed bones, the story would seem patchy and improbable. But the bones are not alone. There are middens, hearths, and a few pieces of ochre that look suspiciously like calendars. There are genes, passed down in teeth, in blood, in mitochondria. Pieces of us still carry the faint signatures of those early expansions. An allele in a Tibetan lung, a mutation in an aboriginal genome, ghosts of movement, written not in stone but in cell. And maybe that's the most humbling part. We think of ourselves as sedentary now. We build cities, erect walls, plant flags. But beneath it all, our species is still wired to move. Not randomly, but curiously. To ask what's over the ridge, to push a little further, to remember where the rains once fell, and to bring with us not just tools or genes, but songs, names, ways of being that have survived 10 times longer than any empire. By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were no longer visitors, they were residents. And the Earth would never be the same. But here's the question we still haven't answered. Why us? Why this species? Was it luck? Climate? Language? Fire? Why did this single twig on the human family tree, so recently one among many, become the last one left standing? Or are we still standing at all if we carry the traces of everyone who came before? Because if the ground beneath our feet once held other humans, whose footsteps vanished under rising tides and shifting dunes, then maybe we're not the victors of some ancient game. Maybe we're just the last echo in a very long chorus. And the song we're still singing, of movement, memory, and belonging, might not be ours alone. It might be the Earth's, whispered through us, still walking, still wondering, still moving toward the edge of the map. It's around 50,000 years before the present, and something begins to change, not in our bones, not in our tools, but in what those tools start to mean. Across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia, the archaeological record starts to whisper. Suddenly, humans are leaving behind more than hearths and hand axes. They are leaving stories. Not with words, not yet, but in ochre, beads, carvings, threads, a red smear on a rock wall, a punctured shell buried beside a skeleton, a woven basket long since rotted, but whose impression is still caught in the clay. These are not just survival tools, they are signals, symbols, warnings, prayers. Whatever they were something new, something soft and strange and deeply human. Before we had cities, gods, and written laws, we had lines and caves. The cave walls at Chauvet, in what is now southern France, are smeared with pigment older than many mountains. Horses, lions, mammoths, all drawn with astonishing grace, possibly as early as 36,000 years ago. And these weren't stick figures, they were motion studies, shading, perspective, even early attempts at animation, repeating animals with multiple legs, as if caught mid-gallop. In a world without video, this may have been the closest thing to watching life happen again. But the most haunting part isn't the art. It's that we don't know why it exists at all. No one was recording food stores or counting sheep. These images were buried deep inside dark caves, far from sleeping sites, where no light reached unless it was brought in. Someone had to decide that a particular image was worth seeing, and then go into a cold black void to make it permanent. If this was mere boredom, it was costly. And if it was religion, it was already abstract. A similar story plays out in Africa. In the cave called Blombos, on the southern coast, archaeologists uncovered pieces of ochre with cross-hatched engravings, dated to around 75,000 years ago. Some researchers argue this may be the earliest known symbol, a deliberate carving with no immediate practical function. Beside it lay beads made from perforated snail shells, stained red. Jewelry, or perhaps identity tags. Personal decoration. Group markers. Whatever the case, someone sat down and did this to a shell, and someone else, probably, noticed. At Pinnacle Point, another coastal cave in South Africa, charred shell middens and pigment-stained tools suggest long-term occupation and the use of fire, shellfish, and minerals to both feed and paint. And again, the effort matters. You don't grind ochre and heat it for hours unless the outcome means something. And apparently, it did. Across sites from Africa to Europe and beyond, ochre appears again and again, not just as paint, but in burial sites, as if it marked a body's passage from one state to another. Red like blood, red like memory, red like a farewell. But art is only half the story, because around this same period, we start finding things that weren't drawn, but made. Snares, threads, tailored clothes. These objects don't fossilize easily, but the indirect evidence is mounting. At Zudzuana Cave in Georgia, dyed flax fibers appear in layers dated to around 36,000 years ago. These weren't just plants, they were spun, twisted, sometimes even knotted. This implies not only rope or string but weaving, and with it, the possibility of baskets, nets, maybe even cloth. A thread is not glamorous, but it is a turning point. You can carry water in a basket, you can trap fish in a net, you can climb a cliff with rope, you can transform your world when you tie things together. And then there are needles. Not crude awls, but actual bone needles with an eye carved through, found in Siberia and dated to around 35,000 years ago. This might sound small, but it was enormous. Before the needle, you could wrap yourself in a hide. After it, you could sew, stitch, layer. You could make clothing that actually fit. In colder climates, this may have been the difference between life and death. But again, it's the meaning that matters. Because these clothes weren't always utilitarian. Some were adorned, beaded, decorated. Our ancestors weren't just covering their bodies, they were saying something with them. This period also marks the explosion of personal ornamentation, beads, pendants, pierced teeth, animal bones carved into figurines or tokens. At Hohlfels in Germany, a small ivory sculpture of a woman with exaggerated breasts and hips, the so-called Venus figurine, was carved around 40,000 years ago. It may be the oldest known representation of the human form. Was it fertility magic, a goddess, a memory, or just a guess at what mattered most? No one knows. But it was crafted with skill and patience, and it suggests that people were not just thinking about the hunt or the cold. They were thinking about bodies, beauty, power, mystery. Language may have existed long before this. There's no fossil record of speech. But here, in these buried tools and paintings, we start to glimpse what may be its symbolic sibling: culture, memory stored in objects, meaning passed without explanation. You don't need to speak a language to know that a grave filled with red ochre and pierced beads meant something to someone. You just have to look. It's also here that burial becomes more common, or at least more visible. While earlier hominins may have buried their dead on occasion, it's during this window, roughly 50,000 to 30,000 years ago, that intentional burials with grave goods appear more consistently. In Israel, at Kafse and School, some earlier Homo sapiens were already placing shells or tools with their dead. But later sites in Europe and Asia show more elaborate rituals: ochre, ornaments, even animal bones placed near or on the body. These were not just corpses disposed of, they were bodies remembered. This might be the true moment of divergence, not between us and Neanderthals, or between different human branches, but between biology and belief. A spear is biology, a bead is belief. And by this point in the archaeological record, we start seeing a species that could make both. That, perhaps, is what allowed Homo sapiens to persist when others did not. Not superior brains or better tools alone, but the ability to embed memory in objects, to build identity from decoration, and to knit knowledge into stories. But this explanation, like all things in archaeology, is incomplete. Maybe the other humans had art too, and we just haven't found it. Maybe they painted in places that collapsed, or wore symbols that decayed. Maybe their rituals were quieter. Fire doesn't fossilize, nor does a lullaby. Still, something changed in this time window. Across the globe, Homo sapiens began not just to survive, but to self-reflect. They carried pigment across hundreds of kilometers. They sang into caves. They buried their dead with tokens of care. They pierced shells and wore them on cords. They carved tiny figures and gave them meaning. They invented ways to tie, bind, weave, and seal the elements of their world. And somewhere in this tangle of thread and ochre, something new began to emerge. Not a better tool, but a more permanent memory. Because survival is never just about killing or eating. It's about continuity, about carrying something forward into the next day, the next life, the next world. And for a species that was slowly spreading across unforgiving continents, these small symbols, these beads, threads, pigments, and patterns, may have been the anchors that held us together. A thread is not just a thread. It's a line drawn between past and future. But the question still lingers. Did culture save us? Or did we invent it because we were already beginning to disappear and needed something to remember ourselves by? And if that's the case, what will our beads look like to the archaeologists of the future? There was a time not long ago when the world felt more crowded than it does today. Not by numbers, but by kinds. Between 60,000 and 30,000 years ago, the Earth held not one species of human, but at least four. Homo sapiens, the newcomers. Neanderthals, the veterans of Europe. Denisovans, still mostly a whisper in the mountains of Asia. And perhaps others, flickering in the fossil margins. For a brief moment, one that spanned thousands of sunrises, the continents did not belong to a single story, but to overlapping lines, tangled in migration, adaptation, and quiet coexistence. This was the time of the others. And strangely, the archaeological record suggests it was not defined by violence, or at least not exclusively. When Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and moved northward and eastward, they did not immediately sweep the board. In many places, they arrived in landscapes already spoken for, forests already walked, caves already lived in. The evidence does not scream of conquest. It hints instead at something far more interesting, a period of parallel lives, sometimes touching, sometimes blending, but often simply existing side by side, unknowingly or unbothered. Let's start in Western Europe, where some of the most famous fossils and tools have given us the illusion of clarity. The Neanderthals had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. By 60,000 BCE, they were already well adapted to the Ice Age ecosystems that pulsed across the continent. From Iberia to the Caucasus, they made efficient use of flint tools, mostly Mysterian in tradition, tailored to hunting large game and surviving the cold. Their settlements suggest seasonal movement, an intimate knowledge of terrain, and complex group behavior. Then something shifted. Around 45,000 BCE, in a few isolated sites, not everywhere and not all at once, a different kind of stone tool begins to appear. Long blades, bone points, ornaments, the markers of Homo sapiens. And curiously, some of these layers sit on top of Neanderthal ones, while others are mixed, like the past was being rewritten with two hands. The Châtelperronian industry is one such example. Found in parts of France and northern Spain, it features tools that look like a blend of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens techniques. Too sophisticated to be accidental, too unique to be fully borrowed. And yet, the fossils found with them are Neanderthal. That has led to a quiet revolution in thinking. Rather than treating Neanderthals as obsolete or doomed, some archaeologists now see this period as one of cultural contact. Not only did these groups possibly meet, they may have watched each other work, learned from each other, and adapted in response. One hypothesis suggests that Neanderthals in contact zones adopted some aspects of Homo sapiens technology, perhaps through observation or exchange. Another possibility is more poetic, that these tools reflect a convergence of minds, two types of humans seeing the same problems and finding the same solutions, independently but similarly. We may never know. But it challenges the notion that history moved in a straight line of superiority. Further east, in the Balkans and into the Caucasus, other sites whisper similar stories. The Bachokiro cave in modern-day Bulgaria revealed something extraordinary. Homo sapiens remains dated to over 45,000 years ago, earlier than expected in this region, alongside what may have been overlapping Neanderthal use of the cave. The genetic evidence from these bones even shows recent Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting that interbreeding had already taken place. But again, the layers do not reveal trauma. They suggest occupation, alternation, possibly even interaction. In Central Asia, the picture grows blurrier, but no less compelling. The Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains, from which the Denisovans take their name, was a hub of human presence for over 200,000 years. And it was shared. The layers contain Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, Homo sapiens DNA, and, in one astonishing case, the remains of a single individual with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Not metaphor, literal hybrid. This was not a chance encounter, it was a shared existence over time. What we're left with is not a battle for dominance, but a complex ecology of humans, a web of temporary cohabitations, local adjustments, and occasional meetings that could lead to sex, imitation, or silence. And perhaps most importantly, none of these groups would have understood themselves as species. These weren't tribal flags or DNA test results. They were just other people. Strange looking maybe, different smelling possibly, but still upright, still armed with fire, still capable of speech and memory, and still vulnerable to the same winters, the same predators, the same need for shelter and story. Some regions, like Siberia or the highlands of New Guinea, remain dark zones in this period, not because nothing happened, but because preservation is poor and access is limited. What we do know is that Homo sapiens reached Southeast Asia by 50,000 BCE, and Australia not long after. That suggests an astonishing speed, an ability to adapt to entirely new ecosystems, tropical, arid, coastal, in a way few other species ever managed. But here too, they may have brushed past other humans. The possibility of late surviving Homo erectus or unknown Denisovan populations has not been ruled out. In fact, the DNA record suggests something eerie: genetic traces of archaic humans in modern populations that don't match any known fossil group, ghost lineages, shadows of shadows. So what does it mean to say we shared the Earth with other humans? It doesn't always mean shared fires or shared language. Sometimes it just means coexisting in silence. Sometimes it means bumping into another footprint in the mud. Sometimes it means nothing more than knowing, for a fleeting second, that you are not alone in your shape or your breath. And sometimes it means that long after their bones have vanished, their blood still moves through us. We do not know if the Neanderthals in France envied the blade tools of the newcomers. We do not know if the Denisovans in the mountains told stories of strange dark-haired visitors. We do not know if Homo sapiens children ever played with Neanderthal ones on the edge of a glacier, but we know they could have. We know the timelines overlapped. The caves were warm, the winters were long, and silence does not always mean absence. The haunting question is not what ended these overlaps. That story comes later. The real mystery is how long they lasted, how many generations grew up with more than one kind of human in the world, and whether, in the deep back rooms of our memory, we still carry the echo of seeing someone who looked almost like us, but not quite. In the end, this was the last time history allowed it. After 30,000 BCE, the outlines begin to fade. The caves become quieter. The contact zones disappear. Until one day, there were no others left to meet. And we didn't even know we had been surrounded. They had survived longer than almost anything. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals endured in the shifting shadows of Ice Age Europe. While glaciers scraped mountains and megafauna came and went, they held on. They adapted. They innovated. They raised children, made tools, painted caves, buried their dead. And then, between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, they began to vanish. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic collapse, but slowly, unevenly, and most importantly, quietly. If the story of humanity had a whispered disappearance, this was it. For generations, the question haunted scientists: what caused the Neanderthals to go extinct? But the better question might be, what does extinct really mean when the line between species is blurred by shared blood, common tools, and overlapping landscapes? Still, even without invoking sapiens or hybrid children, we can trace the final footprints of the last Neanderthal populations by looking at their shrinking presence in space and time. Because even without knowing the whole story, the contours of absence still leave a mark. Let us begin with one of the last places they stood, a windswept outcrop in southern Spain known as Gibraltar. In the depths of Gorham's Cave, Neanderthals left behind traces of their stubborn survival: burnt bones, hearths, and even a carved geometric engraving on the rock wall. These were not thriving colonies. They were remnants, archaeological holdouts clinging to the fringes of a continent that had once been theirs. Dated to around 38,000 years ago, the Gorham site may represent some of the last known Neanderthals to walk the earth. But even this timeline is contested. The layers are thin, the evidence subtle, and the story, as always, incomplete. Another ghostly outpost appears further north at Grotte-Mandren, in the Rhône Valley of modern-day France. Here, something remarkable emerged in the 21st century, a sequence of sediment layers that seems to alternate between Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens occupation. One layer, dated to around 54,000 years ago, contains stone points linked to Homo sapiens, sandwiched between clear Neanderthal levels. This suggests not just coexistence, but turnover, a back-and-forth rhythm of disappearance and return. If correct, it could mean that in some places, Neanderthals were displaced, then reappeared, not as conquerors, but as the echo of a fading presence reclaiming familiar ground. Their survival for a time was regional, patchy, interrupted. Elsewhere, other clues hint at the long, difficult decline. In the Mezmatskaya cave of the Caucasus, a Neanderthal infant was buried around 70,000 years ago. But mitochondrial DNA from her tiny bones shows something troubling: signs of extreme inbreeding. This wasn't just a small group. It was a population on the edge of genetic collapse. Modern reconstructions of Neanderthal genomes confirm the pattern: low diversity, high relatedness, and widespread evidence of small, isolated groups. This is the biology of fragmentation, not a vibrant, interlinked species, but disconnected enclaves with few mating partners and declining health. Even Neanderthal brains, so often praised for their size and complexity, may have faced bottlenecks. Cranial remains from late Neanderthal populations show subtle differences from earlier ones. Some scientists speculate this could reflect developmental stress, nutritional shortfalls, or even shrinking group sizes unable to support skilled cultural transmission. Knowledge, like language and memory, is social. When the group thins out, so does the library of the mind. The same pattern appears in their material culture. Mysterian tools, the flake-based stone toolkit long associated with Neanderthals, begin to fade from the record. In some regions, they are replaced by more elaborate blade industries, sometimes attributed to Homo sapiens, other times to Neanderthals themselves adapting and experimenting. The Châtel-Perronian culture in France is a prime example. It combines Neanderthal skeletal remains with advanced tools, personal ornaments, and bone artifacts. For years, this raised hopes that Neanderthals had a late burst of creativity, perhaps even symbolic expression. But the layers are mixed. Some argue the artifacts were borrowed, others that they were independently invented. Either way, they mark the twilight of the Neanderthal world, brilliant, ambiguous, and short-lived. It's tempting to look for a single cause, a volcanic winter, a pandemic, a sudden cold snap, but the truth is probably more mundane and more tragic. Decline doesn't always need a villain. Sometimes it just requires time. Neanderthals had endured multiple glacial cycles, but the final one may have hit them harder than the rest. As ecosystems shifted and prey became less reliable, already small populations might have dwindled further. Territories shrank, families moved or didn't. Birth rates fell below replacement. And across thousands of years, the silence grew. What makes the Neanderthal story so haunting is not its drama, but its intimacy. These were not alien beings. They were close enough to us to blur the edges of species, but distant enough to vanish without a trace. No stone city fell, no monument collapsed, just a gradual fading, like footprints in melting snow. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they didn't know they were going extinct. There were no ceremonies for the last of their kind. No Neanderthal mother knew her child would be among the last to grow up in that lineage. They lived, hunted, loved, and died, as they always had. Until one day, the caves went quiet. In some places, archaeologists still argue over the last hearth, the final tool, the youngest bone. In others, layers once thought to mark their end have been redated, revised, or reinterpreted. Science is not a straight line. It's a slow groping in the dark, brushing against evidence left by people who never meant to be remembered. And yet here we are, reading into the ash, the cut marks, the DNA strands still woven into some of us. What vanished wasn't just a species. It was a way of being human that had lasted longer than we have so far. And as we look at the fragile scaffolding of our own future, built on warming air and crowded land, maybe it's worth asking, what does it take to survive? Not just for a moment, but for 100,000 years? Stay curious, stay calm, and don't assume the ending is written. It's easy to imagine extinction as something done by one species to another, conquest, competition, maybe even cruelty. But what if some disappearances had nothing to do with us at all? What if, in the final chapters of prehistory, it wasn't Homo sapiens or Neanderthals that changed the fate of the world, but a supervolcano, or the invisible flip of Earth's magnetic field? Let's go back, roughly 45,000 years, to a world in climate transition. Ice ages came and went like long, slow tides. Homo sapiens were spreading across Europe and Asia, carrying symbolic memory and ecological adaptability. Neanderthals, already deep-rooted in those northern landscapes, had weathered many cold swings before. But this one may have been different, because this time, nature threw a volcanic tantrum so massive that we're still trying to understand its full effect. We call it the Campanian ignimbrite eruption. It happened in southern Italy, near what is now Naples. Today, we know the region for Mount Vesuvius and the ruins of Pompeii. But what came before those was far worse. The Campanian eruption was not just a local event, it was one of the most powerful volcanic explosions of the last 100,000 years. When it blew, it sent plumes of ash and gas stretching thousands of kilometers across Europe and Western Asia. Some of those layers still show up in archaeological digs. Thin, gray bands of volcanic glass and dust sitting neatly above or between human and animal artifacts. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, and tephrochronology place the eruption around 40,000 to 39,000 years ago, right in the window when Neanderthals were becoming scarcer in the fossil record. Coincidence? Maybe. But some scientists think it's more than that. The idea is simple. If the Campanian ignimbrite led to sudden cooling, ecological collapse, or resource bottlenecks, then Neanderthals, already living in small, scattered bands, might have been pushed past the brink. Their populations may have been too isolated to recover from one more bad winter, one more missed hunting season. And yet, volcanic winter is just one hypothesis. The deeper we look, the more it seems like nature had other tricks up its sleeve. Around the same time as the eruption, Earth's magnetic field did something unexpected. It reversed. Sort of. This event is called the Lachamp excursion, and it lasted only a few thousand years. A blink, geologically speaking. But during that time, Earth's magnetic field weakened dramatically, maybe to just 10 or 20% of its current strength. That matters, because the magnetic field protects the planet from solar and cosmic radiation. When it fades, more radiation reaches the surface. That can change atmospheric chemistry, damage DNA, and possibly affect climate patterns, though the details are still debated. Evidence for the Lachamp excursion comes from lava flows and ice cores. Magnetic particles in volcanic rock align with Earth's field as they cool, locking in a record of its direction. Meanwhile, ice cores preserve chemical markers that reflect atmospheric changes and cosmic ray bombardment. Together, they paint a picture of a planet briefly exposed, a planet without its usual shield. Now here's where things get tricky. The Campanian ignimbrite and the Lachamp excursion may have overlapped, or at least occurred within the same general time frame. That means we're dealing with not one, but two overlapping natural disruptions. A weakened magnetic field, a supervolcano, maybe even cascading climate effects, cooling, drought, or disrupted seasons. For Neanderthals living close to the margins, any one of these might have been survivable. But both? At the same time? That's harder. Of course, we don't know for sure what the impact was. This is prehistory, not a novel. There are no eyewitnesses. All we have are layers of ash, sudden gaps in tool industries, and the eerie disappearance of Neanderthal signs in some parts of Europe. Some sites show cultural replacement, others show continuity. Some have both species living close together, even after the ash. So we can't say the eruption caused extinction. We can't even say it tipped the scale. But we can say this: when nature strikes at planetary scale, even the most resilient creatures, even us, are not immune. It's also possible that these events didn't just hurt Neanderthals, they may have shaped Homo sapiens too. Volcanic ash would have covered hunting grounds, poisoned water, and dimmed the sun. Lower UV levels might have changed how skin produced vitamin D. The radiation from a weakened magnetic field could have subtly influenced mutations or reproductive success, maybe even behaviors. Some researchers have wondered if these stresses contributed to bursts of innovation in sapiens populations, or drove migrations that brought us into new environments. But again, we tread carefully here. This is speculation at the edge of evidence. Still, there's something quietly humbling in all this. For all our symbolic thought, for all our culture and collaboration, we are not outside of nature. We are inside it. A single eruption can wipe out decades of learning. A flicker in the magnetic field can rewrite evolution's script. When we look at the archaeological record, we often want heroes and villains. We want neat answers. Who won? Who lost? Who outcompeted whom? But sometimes the story is more chaotic. Sometimes the answer is, the planet sneezed. And maybe that's the deeper point. Extinction doesn't always follow intention. It doesn't always need a conflict, or even a reason. It can come from the sky, from the ground, from the invisible weave of the atmosphere itself. In those few thousand years between 45,000 and 39,000 BCE, our planet shifted under the feet of every living human, Neanderthal or otherwise, and we're still not sure why one group survived while the others did not. Which leaves us with a final question, quietly echoing in the ash. How many of our ancestors disappeared for reasons we'll never understand? And how many of us are still here only by chance? Imagine standing face to face with someone who looks almost exactly like you. Not quite the same. Their skull is broader, their brow heavier, but close enough that your children could share DNA. You share the same landscape, the same cold wind, the same need to find shelter before winter comes. But what if you also brought with you something invisible, something you didn't even know you were carrying, that they had never encountered before? And what if that tiny passenger changed the entire fate of the species standing in front of you? We rarely think of disease when we picture the deep past. Germs, after all, leave no fossils. But if there is one lesson we've learned from human history, it's that pathogens have always traveled with us, and have often done more damage than any weapon. The Black Death changed the course of medieval Europe. Smallpox reshaped entire continents. And for ancient humans migrating into new worlds, it's possible that viruses and bacteria were the most devastating passengers they carried. Some researchers now suspect that the same might have happened between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, not as a deliberate act, not as warfare, but as biology, blind, automatic, and catastrophic. The idea is simple, but haunting. When Homo sapiens spread out of Africa beginning around 70,000 years ago, they may have carried pathogens that Neanderthals had never encountered, and to which they had no immunity. This wouldn't have required any knowledge or malice, just contact, a shared water source, a cut treated with a dirty flake, a child born of two lineages, a cough in the wrong cave. That would have been enough. We know that when two isolated populations meet after long separation, disease transmission can be devastating. Native American populations suffered catastrophic losses after contact with European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. And while those were modern outbreaks, the principle is the same. New diseases in a naive population can cause dramatic demographic collapse, even without direct violence. Now, we don't have direct fossil evidence for a pathogen-driven extinction. No Neanderthal skull has tested positive for a Paleolithic virus. But we do have genomic hints. In fact, one of the most intriguing clues comes from within our own bodies. Many modern humans, especially those with European or Asian ancestry, carry stretches of Neanderthal DNA. Some of those genes are involved in immune system regulation. They help code for proteins that detect pathogens, trigger inflammation, and manage viral response. Why would those genes stick around? Natural selection. If you inherit a gene that helps you survive a local pathogen, you're more likely to reproduce. And if those genes came from Neanderthals, it suggests something even more interesting. Neanderthals may have had unique immune adaptations to their local environments, developed over hundreds of thousands of years in the north. When Homo sapiens arrived, there may have been a genetic exchange, not just of faces or tools, but of immune secrets. But this is where the story turns. If Neanderthals had evolved resistance to European pathogens, but not to African ones, then the arrival of Homo sapiens could have been immunologically one-sided. In this scenario, sapiens brought new diseases into Europe, perhaps viruses that had circulated among tropical humans for generations. Neanderthals, never exposed before, might have been vulnerable. We don't need to imagine apocalyptic plagues. Even a few persistent infections combined with small group sizes and already fragile survival strategies could have tipped the scales. And there's another twist. The genes we inherited from Neanderthals that help fight infections? Some of them are now linked to autoimmune conditions, lupus, Crohn's disease, even severe reactions to modern coronaviruses. It seems that Neanderthal immune systems were tuned to a different balance, perhaps more aggressive, shaped by cold and scarcity. When introduced into Homo sapiens genomes, those same genes may have helped in the short term but introduced new vulnerabilities later on. Evolution, it turns out, doesn't give out free upgrades. But what's most fascinating here is that we're seeing the traces of ancient biohistory in our modern health. That sore throat, that chronic inflammation, they may carry whispers of an encounter that happened 50,000 years ago, when two species of human touched hands in a shared valley. Genomic studies continue to uncover more of these fragments, especially in the HLA gene family, the part of our genome responsible for presenting foreign substances to the immune system. The more we study it, the more it looks like a battlefield, not of war, but of microbes. We also need to ask what might have traveled in the other direction. If Homo sapiens gave Neanderthals new infections, could Neanderthals have done the same? Possibly. Some of their immune genes were retained after all, which suggests value. But the demographic outcomes were not equal. One population grew and spread, the other dwindled. Again, it may not have been intentional, just imbalance. Some researchers have even speculated about specific types of disease. Respiratory viruses, introduced in crowded shelters. Intestinal parasites, carried in contaminated water. Skin diseases, transmitted through contact. These are models, not proof. But the possibility matters. It reminds us that history isn't just shaped by tools or brains or climate, but by tiny, invisible hitchhikers that ride along with every migration. Of course, we must speak cautiously here. There is no smoking gun, no pathogen genome preserved in ancient bone, and prehistory leaves no autopsy report. But what we do have is enough to raise the question, enough to wonder how many lives were shaped by fevers we can no longer name. How many lineages ended not in battle but in a quiet cave with a child who didn't wake up? This might be one of the hardest truths to face in our own story. that we may have outlived our cousins not because we were smarter, faster, or better, but because we were carrying different microbes, because biology is indifferent to fairness, and because the immune system, like evolution itself, plays a game of dice we can barely see. It's a theory, a possibility, but one that fits the broader pattern of human history. We are not the only species to move, to meet, to merge. But we may be one of the few that brought with us the power to destroy, unintentionally, invisibly, through the things we did not even know we carried. And in the end, the haunting question remains: how many other kinds of humans might still walk the earth had they simply encountered us in another time, or survived the meeting long enough to adapt? The world has never felt as large as it does today. Satellites orbit, data pulses across oceans, and our species, now in the billions, expands into digital landscapes we barely understand. But for most of our existence, the human story was small. Not emotionally small, not insignificant, but literally small. Entire species of humans may have lived and died with fewer members than a modern sports stadium crowd. And somehow, we keep forgetting just how close the margins were. Let's ask something uncomfortable. Not how Neanderthals died, or why we survived, or what mysterious eruption or superior tool gave us the upper hand. Let's ask, how many individuals does it take for a species to quietly collapse? How few does it take for an entire branch of humanity to vanish? Not in a war, not in a fire, but in math. We don't usually like our history statistical. We like spears, skulls, migrations, symbols. But the more we study the final millennia of our ancient cousins, the more it looks like extinction may have had less to do with conflict and more to do with arithmetic. Because when you're living in the Pleistocene, your real predator might not be another tribe. It might be time, chance, and a few too many unlucky births. Let's begin with the idea of effective population size. This is not the number of individuals you could count with a census. It's the number of individuals who are actually passing their genes on to the next generation in a stable way. For most of our extinct relatives, from Neanderthals to the mysterious Denisovans, that number seems to have hovered around the low thousands. In some cases, perhaps just a few hundred. For comparison, that's smaller than the breeding population of endangered mountain gorillas today. And the gorillas at least have conservation teams. In a population that small, genetic drift becomes a slow but inevitable avalanche. Drift is what happens when random chance, not natural selection, changes which genes survive. Over generations, even useful genes can disappear. Small, isolated populations can lose diversity, resilience, and eventually the genetic flexibility to adapt to changing climates, new pathogens, or food scarcity. It's not that they failed to evolve, it's that there weren't enough of them to roll the evolutionary dice. Then comes inbreeding, the quiet tax paid by populations that can't connect across long distances. Neanderthals show evidence of this. Some of the genomes sequenced so far, including a female from a Siberian cave, suggest close kin mating, not because of taboo-breaking behavior, but because of limited options. When the landscape itself becomes a filter, and your species is fragmented into small, scattered enclaves, genetic diversity can't recover. Isolation becomes entropy. Another concept worth mentioning is carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals a given environment can support sustainably. For Ice Age Europe and parts of Asia, carrying capacity was not generous. Glacial cycles pushed ecosystems into flux. Fauna shifted. Cold, dry phases limited plant productivity. These weren't lush Pleistocene Edens. They were jagged, rugged survival zones. For mobile, tool-using humans, this wasn't necessarily a death sentence, but it did mean you couldn't grow your numbers easily. Populations stayed thin. A few bad winters, a disease outbreak, or the disappearance of a single keystone species could ripple across generations. But the most haunting idea of all might be reproductive absorption. This isn't a massacre. It's not genocide. It's what happens when a smaller population is gradually absorbed into a larger one through low-level interbreeding over many generations, until it no longer exists as a distinct lineage. And we have evidence this may have happened, not just to Neanderthals or Denisovans, but to other shadow branches of the human tree that left only traces in our DNA, and none in the fossil record. A species doesn't always end in a grave. Sometimes it ends in a womb. Between 70,000 and 20,000 years ago, something subtle but colossal was happening. Homo sapiens were spreading, in higher numbers, across broader regions, and with cultural systems that seemed to promote faster growth. At the same time, other human populations, who had once dominated Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, were shrinking. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but slowly enough that no one would have noticed at the time. Imagine standing in a valley in southern Europe, or Central Asia, or the Indonesian archipelago in this period of overlap. There are small pockets of humans living in caves or forest clearings. Some are Neanderthals, some might be hybrids, some are early Homo sapiens. They all look like people. They all know how to make tools. They all raise children, gather food, feel fear and joy. But in the background, hidden in the numbers, one group is multiplying, and others are drifting towards zero. Extinction doesn't always mean obliteration. In evolutionary terms, it just means a genetic line no longer continues. That can happen violently, yes, but it can also happen so gently that no one leaves a mark. A drought, a drop in birth rate, a storm at the wrong time, a generation where the last two fertile women don't make it through the winter. And when that happens in a small scattered population, recovery is unlikely, especially if there's a more resilient population nearby, slowly replacing it one child at a time. We tend to want dramatic answers to extinction: volcanoes, comets, wars. But the numbers suggest another culprit: probability. Given small enough populations and enough time, extinction becomes not just possible, but probable. In fact, when researchers run simulations of small prehistoric populations under realistic conditions, climate stress, limited resources, genetic drift, the outcome is almost always the same: collapse. Eventually, quietly, without needing a villain. None of this is to suggest that Homo sapiens were destined to replace everyone else. The universe isn't so tidy, but it may be that we were just big enough, flexible enough, and connected enough, genetically and culturally, to outlast the thresholds that brought our cousins down. Not better, just still here. The mathematical thresholds of extinction are still being studied. There's no fixed number, no hard rule, but many researchers believe that if a population dips below a few thousand individuals without regular mixing from other groups, its long-term survival odds plummet. We know from modern conservation that even large-bodied animals with brains and social lives, elephants, wolves, whales, can collapse if their breeding networks get fragmented. Why would ancient humans be any different? So perhaps the mystery isn't why the others disappeared. Perhaps the real mystery is why we didn't. Perhaps we're the anomaly, the statistically unlikely survivor, the lineage that, by luck or linkage or both, made it through the bottleneck. And that leads to a final, sobering thought. If human extinction can happen through numbers alone, without war, without apocalypse, then maybe we should stop asking what killed the others, and start asking how close we might be, even now, to the same silent edge. After all, the story of the others is not just ancient, it's mathematical, and math doesn't forget. It is a strange thing to say you carry ghosts in your body. Stranger still when those ghosts weren't quite human, or maybe they were. They walked upright, made tools, traveled far, and raised children. They buried some of their dead. They looked into the same ancient skies. But they were not us, and yet, they are still inside us. Not metaphorically, but molecularly. If you are not from sub-Saharan Africa, you are likely walking around with a few % of your genome borrowed from people who went extinct over 30,000 years ago. Which raises the question, did they really vanish? This is not a story of conquest, or war, or even disappearance. It is a story of absorption. A story where extinction, for once, did not mean total erasure. Instead, it left behind fingerprints on our immune system, our skin, our brains, our sense of altitude, our metabolism. What began as a quiet meeting in a cave or a valley or under an ice age sky became something much longer lasting, a merger of lineages, a genetic handshake that never fully unclasped. The evidence began emerging quietly in the early 21st century. When scientists sequenced the first full Neanderthal genome in 2010, what they found was not a simple story of separation. It was a mosaic, a scattered pattern of shared alleles between Neanderthals and living humans from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What was supposed to be an ancient fork in the tree turned out to be a braid, laced with encounters and inheritance. The same pattern appeared with Denisovans, those mysterious cousins from the highlands of Siberia. People from Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and even Tibet showed chunks of Denisovan DNA, sometimes in surprising places like the EPS1 gene, which helps regulate oxygen in the blood. This gene, likely introgressed from Denisovans, is what allows modern Tibetans to thrive at high altitudes. This is no small footnote in our evolutionary history. These archaic lineages have left behind a genetic legacy that is measurable, mappable, and in some cases, still functional. Around 2% of the genome of non-African populations today is Neanderthal in origin. For Denisovan DNA, the number is smaller but more regionally concentrated. Melanesians, for instance, carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. Some of these fragments are neutral or silent, simply lingering. Others seem to have had an advantage, particularly in genes related to the immune system. The HLA complex, for example, responsible for recognizing pathogens, shows signs of archaic contributions that may have helped our ancestors adapt to new diseases as they spread across the world. Yet it is not all survival benefit. Some Neanderthal DNA has been associated with negative effects in the modern context: susceptibility to type 2 diabetes, depression, nicotine addiction, and even certain skin conditions. What once may have helped us thrive in Ice Age Eurasia may now misfire in the modern world. Evolution is a trade-off, and borrowed genes come with baggage. This legacy is not static either. Over the past 50,000 years, natural selection has been pruning, keeping some archaic segments and slowly eliminating others. Vast stretches of the human genome are what geneticists call archaic deserts, regions curiously devoid of Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry. These deserts are not random. They cluster near genes linked to brain development, language, and reproduction, hinting that some aspects of Neanderthal biology were incompatible with Homo sapiens in the long run. And yet, the persistence of even a few percent of Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry means that these ancient humans were not a completely separate species, not in the biological sense. They were close enough to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Whether that happened often or rarely, with love or coercion, over generations or in brief moments, is something we may never fully reconstruct. What we do know is that it happened more than once, in more than one place, and that the result is now in us. The history of humanity is not a pure line. It is a patchwork, a palimpsest, a braid woven with threads that once belonged to someone else. The mystery deepens when we consider the strange patchiness of this ancient inheritance. Some sections of our genome, particularly those involved in the immune system, seem to have welcomed archaic DNA like a beneficial graft. Genes linked to HLA, for example, a key player in fighting infections, appear to carry Neanderthal and Denisovan signatures in many modern populations. These may have helped Homo sapiens adapt more quickly to unfamiliar pathogens as they moved into new environments already inhabited by older lineages. In these regions, ancient genes did not fade. They competed, they stayed, and they kept us alive. But not all traces were welcome. In other areas of our genome, particularly those linked to fertility or brain development, there are deserts, regions where archaic DNA is almost entirely absent, as if evolution itself had edited them out. These gaps are among the strongest evidence that interbreeding did happen, and that it wasn't always advantageous. It suggests that hybrids were real, that their bodies worked, but that something in the deep machinery of life made parts of that inheritance incompatible. Maybe the differences in sperm recognition proteins caused issues in reproduction. Maybe subtle changes in neurological development made hybrid offspring less viable. We don't know. What we do know is that natural selection didn't keep everything. This idea, that our species is not a clean branch but a braided stream, challenges how we think about identity. We didn't simply replace the others. We absorbed parts of them, not equally, and not always with benefit, but enough to leave permanent signatures. The more we sample genomes from different populations, especially from regions historically underrepresented in science, the more we find echoes. Denisovan DNA shows up in unexpected places, not just in Melanesians, but in scattered low-frequency signals among South and East Asian groups. It means the interbreeding may have happened more than once, in more than one place. A quiet, intimate story, written in skin, blood, and time. And even now that DNA may still be shaping us. Some studies suggest that Neanderthal variants influence modern traits, from skin pigmentation and hair type to susceptibility to depression, nicotine addiction, and even the timing of menopause. These effects are often small, statistical, and still debated, but they whisper something profound, that our evolutionary past is not over. It continues in how we sleep, how we get sick, how we age. And while no Neanderthal or Denisovan walks the earth today, their biology is stitched into our bodies, not as ghosts, not as enemies, but as distant kin, still speaking in molecules. This doesn't mean we should romanticize admixture. It wasn't a grand moment of unity. It was likely rare, circumstantial, and sometimes traumatic. But it mattered. It blurred the boundaries we keep trying to draw. The question of species, where one ends and another begins, breaks down under the weight of actual biology. What matters more is reproductive isolation, ecological roles, and time. From that perspective, we didn't just outlive the others, we outlasted the last clean lines. Today, no Homo sapiens carries a genome unmarked by the ancient world. So maybe the final irony is this: the extinction of other humans didn't mean their total erasure. It meant transformation, a slow folding of the past into the present, a reminder that what we call modern is not a rupture, but a palimpsest, layered, inherited, complicated. We are the only humans left, yes, but we are not alone in our blood. They are not in our museums. They are not drawn in textbooks, and yet they are there, quietly lingering in the bloodstreams of millions. Not a single bone has been assigned to them. No cave art, no tools, no name. But we know, almost with certainty, that they existed. Not because we saw them, but because something left an imprint. Something left behind its code. And in that code, in the base pairs of genomes sampled from modern humans in Africa, Oceania, and parts of Asia, we found echoes. The kind of echoes that only arise when something long gone brushed against us, long enough to be remembered in chromosomes, but too briefly to be remembered by history. This is the story of the ghost populations. Humans, or something close enough to be called human, who lived, mated, wandered, and vanished without leaving us anything but a molecular trail. Between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, the world's population of Homo sapiens was increasing. We were spreading, populating coastlines, mountain plateaus, and riversides, from the Ice Age edges of Europe to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. But we were not the only ones still walking the earth. Even as Neanderthals and Denisovans were retreating, there were others we may never see. And for a long time, we didn't even know they existed. The first hint came not from a cave, but from a computer. In the early 21st century, geneticists began sequencing high-coverage genomes from modern human populations, especially in Africa, where Homo sapiens had the longest continuous history. What they found was messy. It was not a clean evolutionary tree with neat branches. Instead, it was a tangled bush. And deep within African genomes, especially those of West African populations such as the Yoruba and Mende, were segments of DNA that didn't fit the picture. These weren't from Neanderthals, they weren't from Denisovans, they were from something else, something older, something that had diverged from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and yet still, at some point, encountered us. In genetics, a ghost population is defined as a group inferred from DNA evidence, but never directly observed. We don't have their fossils, we don't know their faces, but their genetic fingerprints are still preserved in ours. These fragments often appear as stretches of DNA with high divergence, meaning they differ so much from modern human variation that they must have originated in a separate, long, isolated lineage. One major study, published in 2020, estimated that up to 19% of the genetic ancestry of some West African populations could be traced to a now extinct archaic hominin. This ghost lineage likely split from the ancestors of Homo sapiens more than 500,000 years ago, and yet it survived long enough to contribute genes to our family. And then it was gone. And Africa is not the only place haunted by lost humans. In East Asia, researchers found signs of unknown archaic introgression in certain modern populations, genetic variants that did not come from Neanderthals or Denisovans but from something else. In Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, in the DNA of indigenous groups, There are whispers of another mystery lineage, sometimes called Denisovan-like, but distinct. It is possible these signatures come from yet undiscovered Denisovan populations, or they may represent entirely different hominins that coexisted and occasionally interbred with arriving Homo sapiens. One study from 2023 suggested that people from the Philippines might carry genetic traces from at least 3 separate archaic groups, only one of which matches known Denisovan DNA. What this suggests is a sobering, staggering possibility. For every hominin species we have named, there may have been 2 or 3 we have never found. The fossil record is brutally incomplete. Bones decay. Tropical environments especially tend to dissolve ancient remains, and populations that were small, scattered, or restricted to remote regions may have vanished without a trace, archaeologically speaking. But their genomes may still speak. When a child was born from a union between 2 species, say a Homo sapiens mother and a ghost lineage father, some of the child's DNA would carry markers from that vanished world. If that child had children of their own, and those children passed it on, the fragments would continue down the line, diluted, yes, but detectable. And here is the difficult part. These fragments don't come with a name tag. We cannot say with confidence what species they came from. We cannot link them to a skull or a site. In some cases, we don't even know whether the ghost lineage had traits we would recognize as human. Did they bury their dead? Did they speak? Did they make tools? We may never know. But we do know that they were close enough to us to make fertile offspring. And that one fact, that we could mate and pass on genes, places them within our family, whether or not we ever meet them in the ground. There is one case that perfectly illustrates this haunting ambiguity. A child's tooth found in Laos, dated to between 160,000 and 130,000 years ago. Its morphology is unusual. It looks Denisovan, but not entirely, and the DNA is too degraded to be sequenced fully. It may be from a population that's split from the Denisovan lineage, or from one we haven't even imagined yet. And then there's the case of the mysterious super-archaic ancestry in Melanesians, hints that not only did Homo sapiens mix with Denisovans, but that Denisovans themselves may have interbred with even older lineages before they met us. This raises a strange, almost mythic possibility, that some modern humans carry DNA from hominins who diverged from our line nearly 2 million years ago, perhaps close to the time of Homo erectus. But we must tread carefully. The further we peer into deep time through the lens of genetics, the fuzzier the outlines become. Errors multiply, sample sizes are small, and our models depend on assumptions that may not always hold true. Geneticists themselves are the first to say, we cannot always know what we are looking at. A ghost lineage is a statistical artifact, a pattern in the data that suggests something real but does not guarantee it. The gaps are real. But how we fill them, with other humans, with almost humans, or with imagined species, is still an open question. And we must be comfortable with not knowing. Still, the implications are profound. They suggest that the world of 40,000 years ago was even more populated with possibilities than we thought. Not just Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo sapiens, but a whole bush of hominins. Some that left tools, some that left genes, some that left neither. We were never alone. And in some parts of the world, we may have been the newcomers, the odd ones, the invasive species. And now, there is an irony. These ghost populations, once lost to time, are being resurrected not by shovels, but by servers, by algorithms, by comparative genomics and probabilistic models. In a strange reversal, we may someday reconstruct an entire species from its descendants without ever digging up a skull. Imagine that. A species we never saw, whose face we never knew, whose bones we never held, brought back to theoretical life by patterns in the cells of people walking among us. It is science at its most humbling and most bizarre. So what does this mean for the question we started with? Why are we the only humans left? The answer, increasingly, is that we are not. Not entirely. We carry ghosts. We carry fragments. Our genome is a palimpsest, a layered record of meetings, minglings, and disappearances. We are not a pure species. We are a mosaic. And somewhere in that mosaic, hidden in the silent corridors of DNA, are the last whispers of people whose names we will never know, whose stories we will never hear, but who, for a fleeting moment, walked the same earth. And maybe that is what it means to survive. Not to leave behind bones or tools, but to leave behind something that persists, something that rides quietly in the blood of strangers, something that never speaks, but never entirely fades. And if they're still here, if even the faintest parts of them remain, can we truly say they are extinct? We begin with climate. The Pleistocene, stretching from 2.5 million to about 12,000 years ago, was a masterclass in instability. Glaciers advanced and retreated with the patience of geological centuries, but the suddenness of ecological catastrophe. For every step of warmth, there was an avalanche of cold. Rainforests gave way to dry steppes, deserts turned briefly green, and coastlines marched back and forth with the rise and fall of ice. For early humans, this meant migration or death. And for small populations, the line between adapting and vanishing could be drawn by a few failed seasons. It is not hard to imagine that in some places, a prolonged drought, a shift in prey migration, or a sudden cold snap may have pushed entire groups to collapse. But the thing is, climate doesn't kill equally. It is a pressure, not a sentence. It filters, but it does not decide. And some human species, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, had already survived multiple glacial swings. They were no strangers to ice, which means climate alone cannot explain their disappearance. Then there is the question of culture. If one group had tools, language, stories, or networks that allowed for greater flexibility, greater storage of knowledge, and more complex cooperation, that group may have had an advantage. Homo sapiens, it seems, had something like this. Not necessarily better tools in the beginning, but more varied ones. Not more intelligence in the way we often imagine, but perhaps a broader ability to adapt behaviorally. The rise of symbolic thinking, shared rituals, long-distance trade, these gave us resilience, the ability to move, remember, and adapt as a collective. But culture, like climate, is not a singular cause. Neanderthals had fire, burial, pigment use, and perhaps even some symbolic objects. The Denisovans left us no clear art, but their genes live on. Culture helps explain survival, but does not guarantee it. Disease is harder to trace, but possibly just as decisive. When populations come into contact, so do microbes. If Homo sapiens carried pathogens that the other species had never encountered, and if those pathogens were lethal, the impact could be catastrophic. Genomic studies suggest that we retain Neanderthal immune genes, which means those genes conferred some advantage to us. But what if the opposite was not true? What if our diseases did not spare them? And what if, over thousands of years, contact zones became epidemiological traps, silent extinctions that left no archaeological evidence? There is also the math. Small populations, once reduced past a certain point, can fall into extinction spirals. Inbreeding increases, genetic diversity plummets, mutations accumulate. A single storm, a predator attack, a failed hunt, and the last few individuals may vanish. Some final Neanderthal groups in Europe appear to have survived in scattered pockets, but with numbers in the hundreds or less. That is not a stable population. That is a candle flickering in the wind. It's not that they lost a war, it's that they ran out of time. And yet, none of these, not alone, can explain why Homo sapiens endured while all the others disappeared. Because we were not always more numerous. We were not always more advanced. And we were not, in any cosmic sense, inevitable. We may simply have been lucky. Lucky to be in the right place when the climate turned. Lucky to interbreed when it mattered. Lucky to avoid the worst eruptions or floods. Lucky to live just far enough apart to avoid epidemic collapse. Lucky to have a few extra children survive when the others did not. Evolution is not a ladder. It is a field of dice. And the fact that we are here, asking these questions, does not mean we were meant to be here. The truth is, we probably shouldn't be here. Not alone, at least. There is no law of nature that required Homo sapiens to be the final surviving human species. In fact, for most of our evolutionary history, the idea of being alone would have sounded absurd. If you were born any time before 30,000 years ago and wandered long enough across Africa, Europe, or Asia, you would have eventually run into another kind of human. Someone with different bones, a different brow, perhaps a different language. But someone. And now, you wouldn't. Looking back, the list of ways a human species could die is not short. Catastrophic climate shifts, volcanic winters, genetic bottlenecks, infectious diseases, isolation, inbreeding, technological stasis, cultural stagnation, predators, starvation, or, of course, another species that outnumbers you 10 to 1 and doesn't take up much space. And yet, here we are, a species that wasn't supposed to win anything but somehow outlasted everyone. It would be tempting to say that Homo sapiens survived because we were smarter or stronger or better at something. But if you've made it this far through the story, you know it's not that simple. This wasn't a clean victory. It wasn't even a competition. It was more like a slow unraveling of parallel stories, each one ending while ours just kept going, for reasons we still don't fully understand. Let's try, carefully, to look back at those reasons. The first, and most brutal, is simply climate. Ice ages are ruthless editors of the living world. Starting around 115,000 years ago, the last glacial period reshaped ecosystems across the planet. Forests retreated, grasslands advanced, sea levels dropped. In many places, water vanished, and so did the animals that depended on it. For human populations living close to ecological limits, which was most of them, these shifts could mean the difference between a barely stable population and a collapse. When food webs fray, small populations don't shrink, they vanish. We have evidence that Neanderthal habitats in Europe began to fragment long before their final disappearance. The same is true for Denisovan territories across the Asian highlands. Isolation magnified stress, and stress made every other threat more dangerous. The second factor is invisibly small. Microbes. We now know that modern humans and archaic humans carried different immune profiles. When Homo sapiens left Africa and encountered new relatives, we didn't just trade genes, we likely traded germs. New pathogens introduced into small, isolated human groups could have spread faster than they could adapt. In a small enough population, even a modest increase in infant mortality or reproductive complications can be enough to push the group toward extinction. This wasn't warfare, it was biology. And then there's culture. We hesitate to use the word superior, but Homo sapiens developed an unusual combination of traits that may have helped us weather disasters more flexibly. Tailored clothing allowed us to expand into colder regions. Symbolic thinking, seen in ochre use and beadwork, likely helped us form larger and more cohesive social networks. The ability to remember stories, map landscapes in our minds, and share information verbally would have increased our odds of survival in unfamiliar territory. But we didn't invent these abilities from scratch. Other humans likely had elements of them too. We just happened to develop the full suite, or at least the version that scaled well. There's also a quieter, less satisfying explanation: population size. Homo sapiens were simply more of us. And more of us meant more variation, more babies, more ideas, more backup. Genetic drift is cruel and indifferent. If a population drops below a certain threshold, recovery becomes statistically unlikely. Once the last 10,000 Neanderthals were scattered across a freezing, shifting landscape, their odds were already against them. If they'd had 10 times that number, we might not be having this conversation. And then there is luck. No scientific paper will ever list luck as a variable, but that doesn't make it any less real. The volcanic eruption in Italy around 40,000 years ago may have hit Neanderthal populations harder simply because of where they were living at the time. A shift in migration timing may have placed Homo sapiens in a slightly more favorable corridor just before a glacial squeeze. These aren't decisions. They're accidents that, over long enough time, become history. None of this explains everything. In fact, it's possible that nothing ever will. That's the nature of paleoanthropology. We work with fragments, bones and teeth and sediment and DNA strands that survived by miracle. Each clue is precious, but none of them complete. For every Neanderthal burial we find, there are 10,000 we never will. For every Denisovan molar pulled from a Siberian cave, there are centuries of lives unrecorded. And for every theory about why the others vanished, there is an equal and opposite uncertainty. It is worth remembering that extinction is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens quietly, without a final battle, without an eruption, without a line in the sand. A few generations fail to reproduce. A few children are absorbed into neighboring groups. One day, no one remembers the last pure voice. The name fades. The culture thins. The fire is never relit. And yet, a piece of them keeps walking, inside us. Which brings us back to that haunting question. Why did they vanish, and not us? The most honest answer is that we don't know, not fully. We can list the possibilities, we can weigh the data, but the real story, the one written in memory and silence and soil, is mostly gone. What we do know is that survival wasn't guaranteed. Our story was never inevitable, it was just the one that didn't stop. Maybe that's the most important idea to hold on to, that being here, being the only ones left, isn't a triumph. It's a responsibility. We carry the voices of a dozen forgotten humanities, scattered through our genome, woven into our past. And the fact that we don't fully understand how we got here only makes their silence more profound. They were people too, not failed versions of us, just different experiments in being human. Some of them walked upright before we did. Some made fire before we did. Some may have buried their dead, cared for the sick, shared myths under stars, and loved as deeply as we do now. They deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered, not just for how they died, but for how they lived. And we, the accidental victors of a long, strange game of survival, might do well to stay humble about it. We are not the peak of evolution. We are a temporary branch, lucky enough to still be climbing. So here we are, Homo sapiens, the last human standing, for now. The year is around 10,000 before the Common Era. In the quiet cradle of a changing Earth, something that had never happened before in millions of years is now true. For the first time since the beginning of the genus Homo, there is only one species left. One upright ape who now lives not as one group among many, but as the sole representative of a once crowded tree. All the others are gone. The Denisovans have vanished from the shadowed plateaus of Asia. The Neanderthals, who once ruled the cold steppes of Europe, are silent. The small-bodied humans of Luzon and Flores no longer climb their island slopes. And even the mysterious cousins we never named, the ones who left only faint echoes in our DNA, have disappeared from the world. There is only us, Homo sapiens, and we have no idea what that means. It is tempting to tell this story as a victory, to look backward across the Pleistocene and see a competition we somehow won. We were smarter, faster, more adaptable. We built tools, shared language, painted caves, and walked to the ends of the earth. But the truth is less triumphant, because the more we learn, the more we realize that we are here not because of what we did, but often in spite of it. We are not the most successful species in history. We are the one that lasted. And sometimes, that difference is everything. There was no moment of coronation, no time when sapiens looked around and realized we were alone. The last Neanderthals faded quietly in places like Gibraltar and Mandarin, living out their final generations in shrinking pockets of land as their world grew colder and their kin grew fewer. The Denisovans, never abundant to begin with, may have dwindled in silence somewhere in the highlands of Central Asia or along the coasts of island Southeast Asia, without ceremony or legacy, except the one written in our blood. Even in the places where humans did not directly overlap, the disappearance was just as real. The long experiment of multiple human species running in parallel came to an end, and we didn't notice. For almost 2 million years, Earth had been a crowded stage. At any given moment, there were often 3, 4, sometimes more kinds of humans walking the same continents. Their faces would not have been so different from ours. Some may have laughed, mourned, or shaped stone tools in ways we still struggle to classify. The distinctions between species were real, but not always visible. And yet, sometime between 100,000 and 10,000 years ago, that diversity collapsed. Not all at once, not with a single cause, but with a slow, uneven fade that left only one lineage upright. When you look at it from the outside, it feels almost eerie. Other mammal lineages do not behave this way. There are multiple kinds of elephants, canids, big cats, and monkeys. Even in the primate world today, there are dozens of species of gibbons, lemurs, and macaques. But in the human family, we are alone. No other hominin has survived to the present. And that raises a question that science still cannot answer. Is this how it was always going to be? Or did we break something along the way? We are still trying to find out. But what the fossil record tells us is that extinction is not exceptional. It is normal. In fact, it is the background rhythm of life. The strange part is survival. And in our case, that survival came with a cost. Because when a branch becomes a trunk, the tree stops growing. By the time agriculture dawns and cities rise, The human story is no longer a chorus. It is a solo. And here is where the real questions begin. What does it mean to be the last? The only? We often imagine prehistory as a prologue to civilization, but maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the only time in which we were part of a broader, stranger family. A family that tested out different ways to walk, think, and live. That grew tall in the north and small on islands. That carried ancient traits through firelight and ice. We carry some of that inside us now. Fragments of genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans, faint patterns in our immune systems and adaptations to high altitude. But fragments are not presents. Ghosts are not neighbors. Something is missing now, and we can feel it even if we don't know how to name it. There is a loneliness in being the only human species left. We do not talk about it much, but it sits underneath our myths, our science fiction, and our deep yearning to understand what came before. We imagine lost civilizations, hidden continents, and ancient knowledge not because they are likely, but because we seem to know that a part of our story is gone. Extinct humans are not just scientific subjects. They are shadows of what we could have been, or maybe what we were afraid to become. It is easy to think of ourselves as inevitable, as if the arc of evolution bent toward Homo sapiens from the beginning. But it didn't. Evolution does not have a direction. It only has variation and time. The reason we are here is because we happen to be the ones who made it through the last bottleneck, the last volcanic winter, the last chance encounter with a changing climate. It could have gone differently. And that fact, that terrifying fact, is what makes our moment so fragile. Because we are still primates, still apes, still bound by biology and error and entropy. We build great systems and cities, but we are not outside nature. We are just navigating it with new tools. And just as the others faded for reasons they could not control, so too could we. Disease, war, ecosystem collapse, or something stranger still. The age of one is not guaranteed to last forever. And yet, maybe that is the lesson. Not triumph, but responsibility. If we are the last, then it falls to us to remember, to study, to imagine, to carry forward not just our line, but the memory of all the lines that came before. When we look into a museum case or hold a fossil cast in our hand, we are not looking at failed versions of ourselves. We are looking at cousins who lived, suffered, adapted, and vanished. They are part of the human story, not its prelude. The quiet truth is this: we do not know why we are alone, and we may never fully know. But we can choose what we do with that knowledge. We can tell the story with humility. We can build a future with less arrogance, and we can honor the ghosts we walk with, even if their names are lost to time. There is one species left, but the echoes are everywhere, and maybe, just maybe, the most human thing we can do is to remember that we weren't always alone. This has been Why Are We the Only Humans Left? The extinction of everyone else, told in full by boring sapien. If this story moved you, unsettled you, or simply helped you feel small in the best possible way, we invite you to support this kind of storytelling. A like, a comment, or a quiet share with a fellow curious human helps more than you know. And if you want to help even more lost stories find their voice, you can subscribe and join our growing circle of night thinkers and slow listeners. Until next time, remember, the fact that we are still here does not mean we were meant to be, but it does mean the story is ours to tell, gently, honestly, and together. Sleep well, sapiens.